Have you ever stayed home alone? The silence in the house, the stillness of the rooms, the strange way your own footsteps sound when there's no one else around. Everything feels just a little too quiet, too empty. But then something breaks the silence. A door creaks, a shadow moves out of the corner of your eye. You think it's nothing, but is it? Tonight, we explore 50 of the creepiest, most terrifying things that can happen when you're all alone in your house. From strange noises in the night to chilling encounters you can't explain, there's one thing you should always remember when you're home alone. Some things aren't as alone as they seem. Story 1. The sound of footsteps approaching your room when no one is there. It was late, far past midnight, when Amy sat alone in her room. The house was quiet, the only sound being the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. She had always loved the stillness of the night, the peace it brought her. But tonight, something was different. Something felt off. The house was old, nearly a century old, in fact. Its walls had settled and creaked for as long as she could remember. But tonight, those familiar noises sounded more pronounced, more deliberate. Amy sat in bed, her laptop glowing in the dark as she scrolled through social media. Her mind wandered, distracted by the unfamiliar feeling of unease that crept up her spine. Then it happened. She heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate steps echoing from the hallway outside her room. The floorboards creaked under the weight of each footfall, just like they always did when someone walked through the house. The sound was clear, distinct. There was no mistaking it. But Amy was alone. Her parents had gone to visit her grandmother for the weekend, and her younger brother was away at a school trip. There was no one else in the house. She paused, her heart thudding in her chest. She had grown used to the house's creaks, the occasional groan of old pipes. But this was different. The steps weren't the usual random noises she had come to expect. They were purposeful, slow, and they were getting closer. 1, 2, 3. The steps grew louder with each passing second, just outside her door. She held her breath, straining her ears to listen. There was no mistaking it. Someone was walking toward her room. Her pulse quickened as her eyes darted to the door, her mind racing for an explanation. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it was the house settling again, or a trick of her imagination. But no, she could hear them, clear as day, each footstep heavy, deliberate. 1, 2, 3. The footsteps stopped right outside her door. Amy sat frozen in her bed, barely breathing. Her mind raced. Should she call the police? Should she hide? The room was dark, the only light coming from her laptop, which now felt useless, as though it had betrayed her. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Every part of her screamed to move, to run, but her limbs were stiff, as though paralyzed by the growing fear. Then, out of nowhere, she heard it, whispered, just loud enough for her to hear. Amy. Her blood ran cold. It was her name. It was unmistakable. The voice was soft, like a whisper carried on the wind, but it was unmistakably clear. Amy. Her eyes widened, and she bolted upright in bed, her breath ragged. No one was there. She waited, her body tense with anticipation. The footsteps, the voice, they had come from the hallway, but now there was only silence. Not even the soft creaks of the house could be heard. Still shaking, Amy gathered enough courage to get out of bed. She moved cautiously to the door, her hand trembling as it reached for the handle. It was cold to the touch, sending a shiver down her spine. She opened the door slowly, peering into the darkened hallway. It was empty. Nothing was there. Her heart still pounded in her chest as she scanned the hallway, the shadows stretching and shifting in the dim light. She was alone. There was no one here. But the footsteps, the voice, they were real. She couldn't explain it, couldn't rationalize it. Someone had been standing just outside her door, and for a split second, it had felt so real. Amy shut the door quickly, bolting it behind her. She backed away, eyes wide, hands shaking. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what had happened. The footsteps, the voice. The more she thought about it, the more unsettling it became. But one thought stood out above the rest. If someone had been outside her door and she had heard their voice calling her name, then where had they gone? Her phone, sitting on the nightstand, buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a text message from her mom. "Hope you're doing okay. We'll be back tomorrow." Amy glanced back at the door. It was still shut, locked. Suddenly, she heard it again. The same slow, deliberate footsteps, this time coming from downstairs. 1, 2, 3. The sound echoed up the staircase, and Amy's heart stopped. There was no mistaking it. They were getting closer again. But there was no one in the house. No one but her. Story 2. A door you swear you locked suddenly, being wide open. It was one of those nights where everything felt off, but nothing seemed particularly unusual at first. Olivia had spent the evening in her quiet apartment, reading a book and sipping tea. The rain had been falling heavily for hours, tapping against the window like 1,000 tiny fingers. The sound was comforting, almost like a lullaby, as she settled in for the night. As usual, she went through her evening routine, brushing her teeth, turning off the lights, locking the doors. Her apartment was on the second floor, far from the street, nestled in a quiet, well-maintained building. She always made sure to lock the door, double-checking the deadbolt before she went to bed. The clock ticked past midnight. She crawled into bed, pulling the covers tightly around her, and finally allowed herself to relax. The rain outside seemed to lull her into a sense of security, the rhythmic sound of water beating against the glass, putting her mind at ease. But then, a noise broke the silence. It was subtle at first, just a faint creaking sound, like the house adjusting to the weight of time. But soon, Olivia could hear it more clearly, the faint sound of something scraping across the floor. She froze. It wasn't the sound of the wind, nor was it the house settling. It was a distinct, deliberate sound like someone or something was moving inside her apartment. Her heart started to race. She sat up in bed, straining her ears, listening for any further movement. But everything was still. The rain was the loudest sound in the apartment now, the rest of the world outside seeming far away. Olivia shook her head, trying to calm herself. It's nothing, just your imagination, she thought, trying to rationalize it. She took a deep breath and got up to check the door. She hadn't heard anything else, but her mind kept nagging at her. The door had been locked when she went to bed. She was sure of it. Her bare feet made soft padding sounds on the hardwood floor as she approached the front door. She stopped just short of it, holding her breath as she reached out. The deadbolt was still in place. Okay, I'm just being paranoid. But then, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The door was ajar. Her stomach dropped as she stared at the gap in the door. She swore she had locked it. She had been so sure of it. She had double-checked, turning the bolt all the way and testing it just to make sure. Yet now the door was slightly open, as if someone had quietly pushed it open after she had gone to sleep. Olivia's pulse quickened. She felt a cold wave of dread wash over her. There was no way she had left it open. No way. For a moment, she stood frozen in the hallway, her mind racing. Who could have been in her apartment? The logical part of her wanted to think it was a mistake, that she had simply forgotten to lock it properly. But the unease gnawing at her gut told her otherwise. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she reached for the door handle. She didn't want to open it, didn't want to see what was on the other side. But she had to know. She had to be sure. With one swift motion, she yanked the door open. The hallway outside her apartment was empty, just as it should have been. There was no sign of forced entry, no indication that anyone had come inside. The only thing that greeted her was the muffled sound of the rain outside and the silence of the building. Still, her nerves were on edge. She stepped back into her apartment and closed the door, carefully locking it again, then double-checking the deadbolt to make sure it was secure. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the door, trying to rationalize the situation. Maybe she had made a mistake. Maybe she had forgotten to lock it properly. But then, something caught her eye. On the floor, just inside the door, was a single muddy boot print. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at it. She hadn't been outside. She hadn't stepped in any mud. And yet, there it was, clear as day, a print on her clean hardwood floor, leading from the door to the center of the room. She stumbled backward, her hands trembling. Her eyes darted around the apartment, scanning for anything out of place. But everything seemed normal. Her furniture was in its usual spots, her books neatly stacked on the shelf. Still, that print haunted her, a stark reminder that something or someone had been here. A sudden noise from behind her snapped her out of her daze. Olivia spun around to face the living room, but it was empty. Her heart was racing now, her every instinct telling her to run. But she didn't. She couldn't leave. This was her home, and she had to be safe. She backed into the kitchen, grabbing a knife from the drawer, her grip tight. But just as quickly as the fear had seized her, something shifted. Her ears picked up the sound of footsteps again, coming from deeper inside the apartment. But this time they weren't outside her door. They were inside her own space. 1 step, 2 steps. The sound grew closer, steady and deliberate. Olivia's mind raced. It couldn't be happening. It couldn't. Click. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment, everything went dark. When the lights returned, Olivia was standing alone, the apartment eerily quiet once again. She lowered the knife, confused and terrified. The footsteps had stopped, but there was no sign of anyone. No one in the room. No one hiding in the corners. Just the distant sound of rain on the window, and the cold, unmistakable feeling that she was being watched. Story 3. The feeling that someone is watching you, even though you're alone. It was a typical Friday night for Mia. She had just returned home after a long week at work, exhausted but relieved to finally have some quiet time. The apartment was still and peaceful, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the building settling. The city outside her window was alive with distant traffic noise, but inside it was her sanctuary, a place she could relax, unwind, and be alone with her thoughts. After dropping her keys on the kitchen counter, Mia kicked off her shoes and made herself a cup of tea. She wasn't in the mood for anything too exciting, just some quiet moments with a book. She settled into her favorite armchair, wrapped in a soft blanket, and began to read. But there was something about the stillness of the apartment that felt wrong tonight. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but the air felt thicker, heavier, as if the apartment itself was holding its breath. Mia tried to ignore it, chalking it up to exhaustion. She turned another page of her book, but the unease lingered, growing stronger by the minute. Every time she glanced up from her reading, her eyes were drawn to the dark corners of the room, the shadows that seemed to stretch and shift in ways they shouldn't. There was no logical explanation for it, but the sensation was undeniable. Her skin prickled. It was a feeling she had experienced before, late at night, in places where she knew she was alone, like a whisper in the back of her mind, or the feeling of being watched by someone invisible. She told herself it was nothing. She was alone in the apartment, and nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Still, the feeling persisted, gnawing at her, making the hair on her neck stand on end. Mia set her book down, trying to shake off the creeping dread that had settled in her chest. Maybe she was just imagining things. She got up from the chair and walked into the kitchen, hoping the movement would distract her, calm her nerves. She opened the fridge, rummaging through it, but the unease followed her, settling like a weight on her shoulders. She paused, the hairs on her arms standing up as she glanced toward the living room. For just a second, she swore she saw movement from the corner of her eye, a shadow, something shifting in the darkness. It was fleeting, so quick she could have been mistaken, but it felt so real. A chill swept through her. Taking a deep breath, Mia forced herself to turn away from the kitchen and walk back into the living room. She told herself it was just the darkness playing tricks on her eyes, the way the shadows danced under the low light. But the feeling was still there, pressing in on her, like eyes on her back, watching, waiting. As she stood by the window, looking out at the streetlights flickering in the distance, Mia heard it. A soft sound, a faint whisper that came from behind her, a rustling, like fabric brushing against skin. It was so quiet, she thought maybe it was the wind or just the house shifting. But then came the unmistakable sound of something, someone breathing. Her heart skipped a beat. She froze. The air around her suddenly felt cold. The stillness of the apartment, now heavy with a presence she couldn't explain. Slowly, she turned her head, her pulse racing. There was no one there. She scanned the room, her eyes darting over the empty space, but there was no one. No movement, no figure lurking in the shadows. The apartment was as empty as it had been when she first walked in. Yet, the feeling remained, wrapping around her like a tightening noose. Mia's breath became shallow as she slowly backed away from the window, her eyes never leaving the corners of the room. The breathing, it had sounded so real. She hadn't imagined it. But what could it have been? She was the only one in the apartment. Maybe I'm just tired, she told herself. She decided to distract herself, to take her mind off the unease that clung to her like a second skin. She grabbed her phone and started scrolling through social media, hoping to lose herself in the trivial distractions of other people's lives. But the sensation of being watched never went away. It only grew stronger. Every time she glanced up, she saw nothing, but the feeling of eyes on her was unbearable. It was as though someone was right behind her, their gaze boring into the back of her neck. It wasn't just paranoia. It wasn't just her imagination. The feeling was real, and it was suffocating her. Mia stood up, her heart pounding. No more of this, she thought. I need to check the apartment. I need to be sure. She walked through the rooms, each step deliberate, her eyes searching every corner, every shadow. The closets were empty, the windows locked, the doors all secure. There was no one here. But that voice, that whispering breath, echoed in her ears. It wouldn't go away. It followed her as she moved from room to room, always just behind her. The feeling that someone was watching her, even though she was completely alone, was unbearable. Finally, she stopped in the hallway, standing in front of her bedroom door. She couldn't take it any longer. She was ready to lock herself in and turn on every light in the apartment just to feel safe again. She reached for the doorknob, her fingers trembling. That's when she heard it again, a soft whisper right beside her ear. Mia? She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. There was no one there. But there was a shift in the air, an undeniable presence, a feeling that she wasn't alone, even though she could see no one. It was as though something was just on the other side of her vision, always present, always waiting. The room was still, the apartment was silent, but the feeling of being watched, it had never been so intense. Mia closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and muttered under her breath, "It's just in my head. It's just in my head." But even as she whispered those words, the weight of someone's gaze never left her. Story 4. The sudden flickering of lights that you can't explain. It was a quiet evening when Rachel settled into her living room, eager to unwind after a long day at work. She had just moved into the apartment a few weeks ago, and despite the few creaks and groans of the building settling at night, she was slowly starting to feel at home. The space was cozy, with warm colors and soft lighting, the kind of atmosphere that made you forget about the world outside. She poured herself a glass of wine and curled up on the couch, a blanket draped over her lap as she turned on the television. The apartment was dimly lit by the soft glow of a few strategically placed lamps. Everything felt perfect, peaceful. Then, the lights flickered. It was a brief moment, just a split second, where the living room lights dimmed and then returned to their usual brightness. Rachel blinked, momentarily distracted by the oddity. She looked up at the ceiling light, which now appeared to be flickering more than usual. She chalked it up to the bulb being faulty, though she didn't recall the light ever acting this way before. Maybe it's just a loose connection, she muttered to herself. She reached for the remote, deciding to turn on something to distract her mind from the unsettling moment. But as she pressed the power button, the lights flickered again, this time more noticeably. The ceiling light blinked off for a full second before coming back on, and the lamp next to her couch buzzed, its light dimming and brightening erratically. Rachel sat up straighter, her fingers tightening around the wine glass. It wasn't the first time she'd experienced flickering lights in her life. She had lived in older buildings before, and sometimes it was just a matter of a bad connection or an overworked electrical system. But this was different. The flickering felt deliberate, almost as if it was trying to get her attention. She turned to the lamp beside her, watching it flicker again. Her heart rate quickened. This is stupid, she thought. It's just an electrical issue. Maybe I need to change the bulb. Still, the unease grew. She reached for her phone and dialed the building's maintenance number. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right, but the logical part of her mind kept telling her it was nothing. Hello? The maintenance guy picked up, his voice sleepy. Hi, it's Rachel from apartment 306. The lights in my living room are flickering and I'm not sure what's going on. Sounds like an electrical issue. I'll send someone up to take a look in the morning, he said, his voice distant. You should be fine for tonight. Rachel felt a sense of relief wash over her, at least knowing someone would look at it soon. But the moment she hung up the phone, the lights flickered again. Only this time, it wasn't just the living room. The hallway light outside her apartment dimmed, and she could hear the faint buzzing of the kitchen light, as if it too was struggling to stay on. She stood up from the couch and walked to the hallway, her bare feet barely making a sound on the hardwood floor. The air felt suddenly heavy, stale even, as she peered into the dim hallway. The bulb above her door flickered again, casting an eerie, pulsating light down the narrow corridor. A cold shiver ran down her spine. Okay, this is weird, she thought, stepping back into the living room. It's not just one bulb, it's the whole apartment. The lights flickered once more, this time accompanied by a strange, low hum. Rachel's eyes darted around the room, looking for any sign of a malfunction. She couldn't shake the sensation that something was off, that the flickering wasn't just a malfunctioning light bulb. The hum continued, growing louder, until it filled the entire apartment. The lights above her flickered again, faster this time. The lamp near the couch seemed to pulse in time with the flickers, growing brighter and dimmer in an unnatural rhythm. She felt like she was in a bad dream, and every instinct told her to run. No. Don't be ridiculous, Rachel tried to reason with herself. She walked over to the light switch and flicked it off, but the buzzing and flickering didn't stop. The lights continued to flash as if they had a mind of their own, refusing to obey the switch. Then, with one final burst of light, everything went dark. Complete silence. No hum, no flicker, just an empty, suffocating darkness. Rachel froze, her breath caught in her throat. The apartment had never been this dark before. It wasn't the kind of dark where your eyes gradually adjusted. It was a void, a deep, unsettling silence that felt heavier than any darkness she had ever known. Her heart raced as she fumbled for her phone. The screen lit up, casting a dim glow around her. She tapped the flashlight icon, and the beam of light illuminated the apartment in harsh, unforgiving angles. She stood there in the center of the living room, her pulse pounding in her ears, trying to understand what had just happened. That's when she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible click, like a switch being flipped in the distance. The lights came back on, every single one of them, bright as day. The living room light, the kitchen light, the hallway light, all of them flickered once more before settling into their usual, steady glow. Rachel stood motionless, her phone gripped tightly in her hand. She couldn't explain it. There was no logical reason for what had just happened. The lights hadn't just malfunctioned. They had flickered in a way that felt intentional, and when they had gone out, it had been total. Absolute. Like someone, or something, had decided to turn the world off, just for a moment. But when the lights returned, everything felt wrong. Rachel slowly walked to the window and peeked outside, scanning the quiet street below. She saw nothing, just the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement, the wind lightly rustling the trees. Still, the sense of unease lingered. Was it just an electrical issue? Or had something, or someone, been trying to get her attention? For the rest of the night, she couldn't shake the feeling that the lights weren't done with her, that they were only waiting for the right moment to flicker again. And when they did, she wasn't sure if she'd be ready for it. Story 5, a phone call with no one on the other end, just breathing. It was the kind of quiet night that wrapped itself around Emma like a soft blanket. The city outside was muffled by the thick curtains, and the only sounds in her apartment were the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards and the ticking of the clock on the wall. After a long day, she was finally ready to relax. A cup of chamomile tea sat cooling on the coffee table as she sat on the couch, flipping through a book she had been meaning to read for weeks. The phone on the table buzzed, interrupting the stillness. Emma glanced at the screen. Unknown caller. She frowned. It was late, and she didn't recognize the number. She considered letting it go to voicemail, but felt an odd curiosity tug at her. Maybe it was a wrong number, someone needing directions. Or maybe a friend who had lost their phone and was borrowing someone else's. She picked up the phone and pressed it to her ear. "Hello?" she said, her voice still warm from the tea. There was a moment of silence on the other end. At first, Emma thought the line had dropped, or maybe she hadn't heard the call connect properly. She was about to hang up when a soft, slow sound came through the receiver. It was breathing. Deep, steady inhalations followed by slow, deliberate exhalations. Emma's heart skipped a beat. "Hello?" she repeated, her voice tinged with uncertainty this time. She strained to listen, but there was no response, just the sound of breathing, a presence on the other end, breathing as if waiting for something. The hairs on the back of Emma's neck stood up, and a cold chill crept up her spine. Her finger hovered over the end call button, but she couldn't bring herself to press it. She listened, the quiet breathing filling her ear. It was unnerving, but oddly hypnotic. The more she listened, the harder it became to disconnect. "Who is this?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. More breathing. "Hello?" Emma tried again, her pulse quickening now. "Is someone there?" There was still no response, just that slow, deliberate breathing. Emma's mind raced, 1,000 thoughts colliding in her head. Could it be a prank? A telemarketer playing some twisted game? The idea of someone prank calling at this hour seemed ridiculous, but the silence on the other end made her stomach twist. The more she thought about it, the more she felt the weight of the situation settle in her chest. A cold sweat broke out on her skin. "Who are you?" she asked again, her voice becoming more urgent. "What do you want?" The breathing continued, uninterrupted. Click. The call ended abruptly, leaving Emma standing there, the phone still pressed against her ear. Her hand shook as she lowered the device, staring at the screen. It was as if the air in the room had suddenly thickened, and her thoughts were swirling in a haze of confusion and fear. Was it a prank? She sat back on the couch, trying to calm her racing heart. But no matter how hard she tried, the lingering sensation of being watched wouldn't leave her. She set the phone down, but her mind kept replaying the call, the slow, deliberate breathing, the way it felt like someone was just there, waiting. She decided to check the number, hoping it would give her some comfort. Maybe it was a telemarketer or a wrong number. She opened the recent calls list and scrolled to the unknown number. Her finger hovered over the entry, but something stopped her. A deep, unsettling feeling that made her stomach turn. What if it's not over? She hesitated before pressing the number. As it dialed, she wondered if it was the right choice. Maybe the person on the other end was just a prankster. Or worse, maybe they were still waiting for her call. The dial tone sounded in her ear, a soft, rhythmic beep that seemed too loud in the silence of her apartment. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then, to her shock, the call connected. But instead of the usual greeting, there was only silence, a pause. Then, the same slow, deliberate breathing. Emma froze, her breath caught in her throat. The sound was exactly the same as before, like the person on the other end hadn't moved at all, hadn't gone anywhere, as if they were still standing there, just waiting for her to speak. Her heart pounded in her chest as she whispered into the phone, "Who are you?" The breathing continued, slow and methodical, but no words followed. The voice she was expecting, the one who would answer, explain, or apologize, never came. It was just breathing, that strange, unnatural rhythm of breath filling her ear with its persistent presence. Her grip on the phone tightened. She was about to hang up when, in the middle of the breathing, she heard something else. A soft, distant whisper. So faint, she almost didn't catch it. "I see you." A chill washed over her. The voice was low, barely audible, like it was coming from far away, but it sent a shiver down her spine, as if the person was right next to her, standing in the dark corner of the room. Emma slammed the phone down, ending the call before she could even think. She sat there in stunned silence, her breath shallow, her hands clammy. Who was that? The phone lay on the table, silent now. But the words, the whisper, the breathing were still alive in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, watching, waiting. The feeling that the call had been more than just a strange, creepy prank. It felt like a warning. Emma couldn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined someone standing just outside her window, watching her, waiting for the next move. And though she tried to tell herself it was all in her head, she knew deep down that something or someone had been there on the other end of that call. And they were still waiting. Story 6, the creak of floorboards as if someone's walking, but you live alone. It was the kind of night when everything felt quiet. The city outside was asleep, its noise muted by the thick windows of Emily's apartment. She had just finished a long week of work, and was looking forward to some peace and solitude. With a warm mug of tea in hand, she settled into her favorite armchair, the soft glow of a lamp casting a cozy light over the room. Her apartment was small but comfortable, one bedroom, a modest kitchen, and a living area with a few plants by the window. It was the perfect size for her, especially since she'd moved in a few months ago. She liked the quiet, liked the fact that she could retreat into her space and not have to worry about anyone else. She had no roommates, no pets, just her and the apartment. And yet, tonight, the silence felt off. As she sat in her chair, the gentle hum of the refrigerator was the only sound breaking the stillness. The air was warm, and the only movement came from the flickering shadows cast by the lamp. She relaxed further into her chair, taking a sip of tea, trying to shake the feeling that something was subtly wrong. Then it happened, a soft creak. It was barely audible, but unmistakable. The sound of floorboards shifting, a faint groan from somewhere in the apartment. Emily paused, her hand still holding the mug. Her mind tried to rationalize the noise. Maybe the building was settling, she thought. The floorboards are old. It's nothing unusual. She waited for the sound to pass, but it didn't. Instead, it came again. Another creak, this time louder, followed by a faint shuffle, as if someone had taken a slow step across the floor. Her heart skipped a beat. She set the mug down carefully on the table, trying not to make a sound. The apartment was still, but the creaks continued, faint, deliberate steps coming from somewhere down the hall. What the hell? Emily's breath caught in her throat. She was certain no one else was in the apartment. She checked every lock before settling in for the night. She had no guests, no family or friends staying over. Just her, alone in the space. The steps were getting closer. Another creak, and then another. She could almost hear the rhythm now, a slow, dragging footstep, as if someone were walking through the hall toward her. The sound was unmistakable, the weight of each step pressing into the old wooden floorboards, sending tremors through the walls. Her pulse quickened. She stood up, her hands trembling as she reached for her phone. She thought about calling someone, anyone, but her mind raced too fast. The thought of picking up the phone felt too slow, too impossible. The footsteps came closer. Not real, she told herself. But the creaks, the slow dragging steps, everything felt so real. A soft thud followed by another creak. It was right outside her bedroom door. No way. Her heart hammered in her chest as she slowly backed away, stepping as quietly as possible toward the hallway. The footsteps didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to be getting closer, like someone or something was slowly making its way down the hall. She reached the door to the hallway and hesitated, listening. The floorboards creaked again. A dragging step, closer, and then nothing. Dead silence. Emily stood frozen in the dim light, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. The apartment felt unnervingly still. She strained her ears, waiting for any sound, any indication of movement. The silence stretched on, but nothing happened. Then she heard it, a slow, deliberate breath, right behind her. Her heart leapt into her throat, and she whipped around. The hallway behind her was empty and still. The light in the hallway flickered once, casting an eerie shadow, but there was no sign of anyone. No footsteps, no breathing, just the quiet hum of the apartment's systems. Confused, her mind spun in circles. She hadn't imagined the steps, had she? She looked down the hall again, her gaze darting across the shadows, looking for any sign of movement. Maybe it's the building settling, she thought, trying to calm herself. Maybe the floorboards are just old. But the fear still gnawed at her. After a few moments of intense silence, Emily decided to check. Her fingers shook as she slowly approached the hallway. She crept down the corridor toward the bedroom, her breath shallow. She knew she was alone, but the fear of something was overwhelming. She turned on the light in the bedroom and peered around, scanning the corners, the closet, and under the bed. Everything was exactly as it should be. But the moment she turned to leave, a shadow seemed to stretch across the room. She froze, her eyes locked onto the corner of the doorframe. Something was there. She couldn't see it, but it felt wrong, like someone was standing in the dark watching her. Slowly she turned, glancing behind her, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Nothing. No one's here, she told herself, though the fear in her chest refused to relent. She returned to the living room, still on edge, and tried to distract herself. The creaking of the floorboards had stopped. For now. but she knew she couldn't ignore it. The sound had been so real, so deliberate. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every creak, every rustle in the apartment made her eyes snap open, heart racing. She kept the lights on, feeling ridiculous, but unable to shake the sense that something wasn't right. The next morning, the sunlight seemed almost too bright as she made her way through the apartment. The floors were silent. The air was calm. No more creaks. But as she passed the hallway, she paused, staring down at the floorboards. They seemed just as they always were, old, worn, and creaky. Nothing special, except for one thing, a faint, almost invisible indentation on the floor near her bedroom door. Was it always there? She wondered, running her fingers over the mark. It looked like the outline of a shoe, like someone had been standing there. Someone who shouldn't have been. Story 7. A shadow moving across the wall when no one is near. Anna sat in her living room, the soft hum of the city outside her window barely audible through the closed glass. She had spent the evening binge-watching her favorite show, a glass of wine in hand and the soft glow of her lamp illuminating the room. It was a peaceful, ordinary night. The apartment was quiet, a small but cozy space she'd lived in for nearly 2 years. She loved it, its high ceilings, its hardwood floors, and the old charm of the building. Everything had always felt perfectly normal, until tonight. It started with a shift in the atmosphere, a faint unease that settled over her like a thin mist. She couldn't quite put her finger on it. There was no sound of footsteps, no creak of the floorboards, nothing that could explain why the hairs on the back of her neck were standing up. But something was off. She glanced around the room, half expecting to find a draft or a misplaced object, but everything was as it should be. That's when she saw it. From the corner of her eye, a shadow flickered across the wall. It was brief, so quick that she thought it was just a trick of the light. Maybe a car passing by outside, its headlights casting a momentary shadow through the window. But when she turned her head, the room was still. The shadow was gone. She tried to shake it off, telling herself it was just her imagination. After all, the apartment wasn't new. It was familiar, safe. She turned her attention back to the TV, but that feeling, the nagging sensation that something wasn't quite right, lingered. And then it happened again. This time, the shadow was longer, more distinct. It moved slowly, as if it were crossing the wall from the far corner of the room to the window. But there was no source for it, no person, no object casting the shadow. Just darkness that seemed to move on its own. Anna's pulse quickened. She leaned forward, her eyes scanning the room, looking for any sign of movement. The walls were empty, the furniture undisturbed. The only light came from the lamp beside her, its warm glow spilling onto the floor, but it wasn't enough to cast such a large, creeping shadow. She stood up, her body tense, every sense on high alert. The shadow had moved again, this time crossing the wall just above the couch, as if something was walking across it. But she was alone. The only movement in the room should have been the gentle flicker of the candle on the coffee table. She grabbed her phone and quickly called her friend Emma, her fingers trembling as she dialed. "Hello?" Emma answered groggily. "Emma, I think there's something wrong with the apartment," Anna said, her voice shaky. "I keep seeing a shadow move across the wall, but I'm alone here. There's no one else." Emma's voice was quiet, confused. "Are you sure it's just your mind playing tricks? Maybe it's a reflection from outside, or the lamp?" "I thought that too," Anna replied, glancing nervously around the room. "But this is different. The shadow's not from anything I can see. It's moving on its own." Emma paused, her voice softening. "Anna, I know you've been stressed lately. Maybe it's just anxiety? You're probably just overthinking it." Anna wasn't convinced. She could still feel the unease settling deeper into her bones. "Maybe," she said reluctantly, hanging up the phone. But she knew in her gut that something wasn't right. The apartment felt colder now, the air heavy with tension. Anna slowly walked over to the wall where she had seen the shadow. Her fingers brushed the cool surface of the wall as she traced the path it had moved along. It was impossible. The shadow had come from nowhere, moving without any apparent cause. She turned to walk back to the couch, but something made her pause. The shadow, now faint but unmistakable, was moving again, slowly creeping across the far side of the room, inch by inch. Her heart skipped in her chest, and her breath caught in her throat. This time, she followed the shadow as it glided along the wall. It seemed to bend around the furniture, as though avoiding the light from the lamp. But no matter where she moved, no matter how closely she watched, the shadow never had a source. It wasn't cast by anything in the room, it just was. A cold chill swept over her as she stared at the shadow. For the first time, she realized it was different. It wasn't shaped like anything she recognized. It was long, jagged, like a dark figure with no clear outline. The edges were blurred, as if it were part of the darkness itself. Her breath quickened, and her hands trembled. "Please stop," she whispered to herself, almost as if pleading with the shadow. But it continued to move, creeping along the wall as if it had a mind of its own. Anna backed away, her eyes glued to the wall, unable to tear herself away from the strange, shifting figure. She turned to leave, her pulse racing in her ears, but just as she reached the doorway, she froze. The shadow stopped moving. It lingered for a moment, as though waiting for her to make the next move. Then, it began to retract, slowly, as if retreating back into the dark corners of the room. It faded until it was gone, leaving only the faintest sense of something unnatural hanging in the air. Anna stood in the doorway, breathing hard, the silence around her deafening. The apartment felt still again, as if nothing had happened. But she knew better now. Something had been there, something that didn't belong. She didn't sleep that night. The walls were silent, the apartment still, but the memory of the shadow lingered, creeping into her thoughts with every passing moment. No matter how many times she tried to tell herself it was just a trick of the light, the feeling of being watched, of something being in that room with her, would never leave her. And though the shadow had vanished, Anna couldn't shake the eerie sensation that it was waiting for her to see it again. Story 8. Hearing Your Name Whispered from Another Room. It was an ordinary Saturday evening when Sarah decided to stay in. The weather had turned cold, and she felt the weight of the week's work pulling at her. After a quick dinner, she retreated into the living room with a book and a cup of tea, the flickering light of the fireplace casting a soft glow on the room. Her house was old, built in the 1920s, and had a certain charm. The creaky floorboards, the vintage light fixtures, and the way the house seemed to sigh as it settled into the night. Sarah had always felt at home in this place, even with its quirks. The way the stairs creaked underfoot, the occasional tapping from the attic, and the mysterious hum from the pipes that ran through the walls. Nothing out of the ordinary. But that night, something was different. She had just turned the page in her book when she heard it. A soft whisper, barely louder than the crackling fire. It came from the hallway, just beyond the living room, the place where the light didn't quite reach. Sarah, her name, clear as day. At first, she thought it was a trick of the wind, a creak in the old house, or perhaps her imagination running wild. But the whisper was distinct, almost as though someone were standing just out of sight, calling to her. She glanced toward the hallway, her breath catching in her throat. There was no one there. She tried to shake off the feeling, blaming it on the isolation of the house and the silence of the evening. It was easy to hear things when you were alone, especially in a house like hers. Still, there was something unsettling about it, the tone, the way it felt so intentional, so personal. It was probably a neighbor, she reasoned, trying to dismiss the unease bubbling in her stomach. But when she checked the time, it was nearly midnight. The street outside was silent, and there was no one else in the house. She shrugged it off, focusing on her book again. But then, just a few minutes later, it happened again. Sarah. This time the voice was closer, just outside the door. Her heart pounded in her chest as she set the book down, the warmth from the fire suddenly feeling distant and cold. The voice had come from nowhere, the kind of voice you'd recognize, familiar yet haunting, as if it had a purpose. It wasn't a gust of wind or the house settling. It was real, and it was calling her. Her mind raced as she stood up, her legs feeling weak beneath her. She glanced around the living room, her eyes darting from the door to the fireplace. The house felt too big and too quiet. She was alone. She always was. There were no guests, no family visiting, and yet someone had just called her name. She stepped toward the door slowly, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. She could hear nothing now, only the sound of her own heartbeat in her ears. The whisper had stopped, leaving only an oppressive silence that seemed to press down on her from all sides. She reached for the doorknob, her fingers trembling. When she opened the door, the hallway was empty. The lights flickered above her, casting strange shadows on the walls. There was no one standing there, no sign of life in the dim light. Just the quiet emptiness that stretched down the hall to the staircase at the end. It's just the house, Sarah tried to tell herself. It's an old house. I'm hearing things. But deep down, she knew the voice had been too real, too close to be ignored. Her hand remained on the door, gripping the handle as if it could protect her from whatever she had heard. She stepped back into the living room, closing the door behind her with a soft click. She locked it just to be sure, though she couldn't explain why she felt the need to. Trying to ignore the creeping unease, Sarah returned to her chair, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The silence in the room felt different now, oppressive, heavy. Every little noise, the settling of the house, the crackling of the fire, seemed louder than before. Suddenly, from behind her came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, measured, as if someone was walking across the floor. Sarah froze. The footsteps weren't coming from the hall this time. They were right behind her, as if someone was walking through the living room, just out of view. She spun around, her heart pounding so loudly it seemed to fill her chest. There was nothing. The room was empty, completely empty. Her pulse thudded in her ears as she stared at the space around her. Her hands were shaking as she grabbed her phone from the coffee table, dialing the first number that came to mind. Emma, her best friend. Anyone. She needed someone to tell her she wasn't losing it. The phone rang once, twice. Hello? Emma answered, her voice groggy. Emma, it's me. Something's happening here. I keep hearing... Sarah stopped herself, suddenly unsure of what to say, hearing footsteps, hearing her name. It all sounded so insane. Sarah, are you okay? Emma's voice was concerned, but still distant. You sound freaked out. I heard something. I swear someone called my name. And now there are footsteps. Her voice cracked as she spoke, the words feeling ridiculous as they left her mouth. Emma paused. Are you sure you're not just spooked? Maybe it's the house creaking or something? You know how old places can... No, Emma, I swear. Sarah's voice was sharp, her frustration bubbling over. I'm not making this up. I heard my name. Someone whispered it, and then there were footsteps. There was silence on the other end for a long moment. Emma's voice broke through the quiet, soft and reassuring. Okay, maybe you should just get out of the house for a bit. Go somewhere else. I'll come over if you want. Sarah didn't want to admit it, but that was exactly what she needed to hear. She had to get out. She had to leave. She stood up quickly, looking around the room one last time before grabbing her keys and phone. But before she could leave, she heard it once more. Sarah. It was louder this time, right next to her ear. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned to face the empty room behind her. And then, for the first time, she saw it. A shadow, darker than the rest, stood in the corner of the room, watching her. Story 9 items being moved or out of place when you're sure you left them where they were. Megan had always been meticulous. She prided herself on her organization and the way everything had its place in her apartment. From the stack of books on the coffee table to the kitchen utensils hanging neatly on the wall, every item had a specific spot, a quiet harmony in her small world. It wasn't just habit, it was a need for control. She liked knowing where everything was. So when she came home one Thursday evening and noticed something out of place, it immediately caught her attention. It was subtle at first. A single mug was sitting on the counter in the kitchen, one that she was sure she had put back in the cupboard earlier that morning. She frowned, but shrugged it off. Maybe she had left it out in a rush or forgotten about it. It wasn't a big deal. She put it back in its spot and carried on with her evening routine. The next day, she came home from work to find her keys were no longer on the hook by the door. They were sitting on the table in the living room, directly in front of the couch. Megan stood still for a moment, staring at them. She knew she'd left them on the hook. She always did. She didn't move them, didn't touch them. But there they were, sitting out of place, as if someone had picked them up and put them down somewhere else. Her heart rate quickened. Was I distracted? Did I do it? No, she was sure she hadn't. That night, she carefully inspected every corner of her apartment before going to bed, checking that everything was in order. But when she opened her closet the next morning to grab her coat, something felt off again. Her scarf was on the floor, twisted and crumpled in the corner, even though she had left it hanging neatly on its hook the night before. Megan's unease grew. It didn't make sense. She had to be missing something, right? Maybe she was sleepwalking, or maybe she'd been more forgetful than she thought. But the more she thought about it, the more it didn't add up. The next evening, after coming home from work, Megan sat down in the living room, trying to distract herself with her favorite TV show. But her eyes kept drifting to the shelves, the place where she kept her collection of antique teacups, gifts from her grandmother. They were always arranged just so. 6 delicate cups in a row, each one a different pastel color, facing outward. When her show ended, she stood up to make dinner, her eyes scanning the room once more. That's when she noticed it. One of the teacups was turned backward, facing the wall. Megan's heart skipped a beat. No. She had arranged them herself just a few days ago, and she was sure that cup had been facing outward with the others. The thought of someone else entering her apartment seemed absurd. She lived alone, never had guests over. The idea of her somehow having forgotten to place the cup correctly seemed more plausible than the alternative. But still, the feeling in the pit of her stomach wouldn't go away. Something wasn't right. That night, unable to shake the growing anxiety, Megan decided to set up a small camera. She placed it discreetly on the bookshelf, pointing toward the kitchen and living room. She told herself that if anything was moving around in the apartment, she would finally have proof, even if it was just her own mind playing tricks. She sat in bed trying to read, but the minutes ticked by slowly. She kept imagining small movements in the corner of her eye. A shadow here, a flicker of light there. The paranoia began to seep in. Finally, she fell asleep. The next morning, she checked the footage before going to work. Her stomach twisted as she rewound the video. It was silent. No one was in the apartment. But then something strange happened. Around midnight, the kitchen light flickered on and off a few times as though someone were toying with the switch. And then, slowly, a drawer in the kitchen began to open. Just an inch at first, then more, until it was halfway pulled out, and after a few moments, it slammed shut. No one was there. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came just a minute later. In the footage, the camera caught the distinct movement of the teacup on the shelf. It wasn't a gentle shift. The cup jerked slightly as if someone had nudged it. Slowly, it turned, facing the wall. Megan gasped and dropped her phone in disbelief. She replayed the footage, her eyes wide in horror. It wasn't her mind playing tricks. She hadn't misremembered or been too tired. Something or someone was moving things in her apartment, and it was happening when she was away. Her thoughts raced. How? How is this possible? She called her friend Kate immediately. Kate, you have to come over. Something is happening here. Things are moving around, and I have footage of it. I can't explain it. Kate's voice was calm but concerned. Megan, maybe you're just stressed. You said you were working a lot lately. Are you sure you're not just exhausted? No, I saw it with my own eyes, Megan insisted, panic rising in her chest. I know what I'm seeing. Kate agreed to come over later that evening. Megan spent the rest of the day in a constant state of anxiety, jumping at every sound, every creak of the floorboards. When Kate arrived, Megan quickly showed her the video footage, her voice shaky with fear. Kate watched it in silence, then turned to Megan. That's really strange, but it could still be a glitch or something, right? Some kind of weird malfunction with your camera? But Megan wasn't convinced. She had watched it over and over again, and there was no explanation. The teacup had definitely moved. The drawer had definitely opened on its own. That night, they stayed up together, watching the living room, waiting for something, anything to happen. The air in the apartment was thick with tension, and every creak, every distant sound seemed amplified. But nothing moved. The house was quiet. No flickering lights, no stray mugs, no misplaced teacups. They both fell asleep on the couch, exhausted from the long night. The next morning, Megan woke up to the sound of the coffee machine bubbling away. She rubbed her eyes, still half dazed from the lack of sleep, but as she entered the kitchen, her breath caught in her throat. Her coffee mug, her favorite, the one with the faded flower pattern, was sitting on the counter. It was placed perfectly on the edge, facing her, as if someone had just set it down there, but she hadn't touched it. It wasn't even close to where she left it. And as her hand reached for the handle, she could swear she heard a soft whisper in the air. Megan. Story 10. Finding strange, unfamiliar fingerprints on your windows or mirrors. It had been a long, exhausting week for Jake. Between work, personal commitments, and a never-ending to-do list, he was looking forward to a quiet Saturday in his small apartment. The apartment was cozy, nothing fancy, but it had a charm that made him feel at home. He was content with everything in its place. Or at least, that's how he thought it was. Saturday morning, Jake decided to take care of some chores. He made coffee, threw a load of laundry in the machine, and began dusting the furniture. As he moved through the living room, he noticed the large window that overlooked the city. The sunlight streamed in through the glass, and as he wiped the windowsill, something caught his eye. A fingerprint. Not just any fingerprint, though. It was large, smeared, and unmistakably human. Jake froze, staring at it for a long moment. He didn't remember anyone being at his apartment recently, and yet there it was, clearly visible against the smudged window. It wasn't a casual print either. It looked deliberate, as though someone had pressed their hand against the glass, then dragged it slowly down. Jake wiped it away, trying to shake off the unease creeping up his spine. Maybe he'd forgotten to clean it off the last time he did a deep clean, or maybe it was just the weather causing condensation. But as he moved toward the kitchen to start breakfast, he noticed something else. The bathroom mirror, fogged from his shower, had the same distinct fingerprints, though these looked fresher, more recent. He stepped closer, eyes narrowing. The prints were smudged around the edges, like someone had leaned up against the mirror and dragged their hand across it. He hadn't invited anyone over for weeks. He lived alone. His heart skipped a beat. Maybe he was just being paranoid, but it felt wrong. He hadn't even heard anyone knock on the door, let alone be in the bathroom. Shaking off the lingering sense of discomfort, Jake decided to brush it off. Perhaps he was just tired from the work week or losing his mind with stress. But that night, as he settled into bed, his mind kept returning to the fingerprints. He tried to sleep, but his thoughts wouldn't quiet. He tossed and turned in the dark, the silence of his apartment only amplifying the feeling of unease. At one point, he thought he heard something, a faint scraping sound from the living room. He sat up, wide awake, listening intently. Nothing, just the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of cars passing by outside. The next morning, the unease had not dissipated. In fact, it had only grown. Jake walked into the bathroom, his gaze automatically drawn to the mirror, half expecting to see those same strange prints again. But this time, there was something even more unsettling. The fingerprints weren't just on the glass. They were arranged in patterns. Strange patterns, like someone had been tracing shapes or writing something on the mirror with their fingers. He reached out instinctively, wiping the mirror with his sleeve. The marks wouldn't come off. They were etched into the glass, as though they were a permanent part of it. What the hell is going on? He stepped back, his breath quickening. He checked every other window, every surface, and found more. More prints. On the bedroom window, on the sliding glass door leading to the balcony. Everywhere he looked, there they were. Impossibly large, with long, deliberate streaks, as if someone had been moving across the surfaces of his apartment without his knowledge. Jake's hands shook as he dialed his friend Mark, needing someone to talk to. Mark was skeptical at first. "Maybe you're just imagining things, man," he said over the phone. "You've been working a lot. Stress can mess with your head." But Jake wasn't convinced. He had seen it with his own eyes. He wasn't imagining it. Mark agreed to come over that evening to help him look around. When Mark arrived, Jake showed him everything. The prints, the patterns, the way they seemed to be everywhere, in every room. "Okay, this is creepy," Mark admitted, his face paling as he stepped closer to the bathroom mirror. He wiped at the marks with his hand, but like Jake, he couldn't get rid of them. These are too specific to be some random thing. They decided to take a closer look outside, maybe even check around the building. But when they stepped outside onto the balcony, Mark paused, staring out over the railing. "Jake," he said slowly, "do you have a neighbor who comes by?" Someone who might have done this as a prank? No, Jake replied, his voice tight. I've never had any issues with my neighbors. They walked to the back of the building and checked the alleyway, but there was no sign of anyone nearby. As they turned to head back inside, something caught Jake's eye. In the corner of the alley, partially hidden in the shadows, was a faint figure. It was hard to make out, but there was a sense of movement, of someone standing just out of sight. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He moved toward it, but by the time he got closer, the figure was gone, swallowed by the night. The next day, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The prints seemed to multiply, appearing on surfaces he hadn't even touched. And now he began to see strange things in the reflections of his windows, the movement of something in the corner of his eye, figures that vanished when he turned to look. He called the landlord, but when he asked if anyone had been inside his apartment recently, the answer was the same. No one had been inside. The building was secure. But the strange prints continued to appear, no matter what Jake did. The longer he stayed in the apartment, the more the feeling of being followed, of being watched, grew. And the more the fingerprints and strange patterns haunted him, like an invisible presence that was slowly consuming his every waking moment. One night, Jake came home to find the entire bathroom mirror covered in fingerprints, thousands of them, overlapping in such a way that they were almost impossible to distinguish from each other. And this time, there was something new. A single word, smudged into the glass, written in the very same fingerprints. Leave. Jake felt the blood drain from his face. Whatever had been leaving these prints wasn't going away. It wasn't something that could be wiped clean. And with that realization, Jake finally understood. He wasn't alone. Not now. Not ever. And whatever was in his apartment, it wasn't human. Story 11. The sound of a doorbell ringing, but no one is there when you look outside. It was a quiet Thursday evening when Laura first heard it, the unmistakable sound of her doorbell ringing. She was curled up on the couch, a book in her lap, and a warm cup of tea beside her. The house was otherwise silent, the dim light of the setting sun casting long shadows through the living room windows. Laura's heart skipped a beat. Who could it be? She wasn't expecting anyone. She set her tea aside and walked toward the front door, her steps light but cautious. Her mind raced through the possibilities. Maybe a package delivery, a neighbor stopping by, or someone she knew just popping in. She peeked through the peephole. The porch was empty, the darkening street stretching out before her with no sign of anyone standing on the doorstep. Frowning, she opened the door, scanning the area. No one was there. A chill ran down her spine. She stepped outside, the cool air brushing against her skin. The yard was empty, the dim streetlights casting pools of pale yellow on the pavement. There was nothing. No car in the driveway, no footprints on the ground, and no sign of anyone. Confused, she closed the door and went back inside. Had she imagined it? The sound of the doorbell had been so clear, so distinct. She felt a pang of unease, but shrugged it off. It had been a long day, and her mind was likely playing tricks on her. That night, after finishing her book and turning off the lights, Laura climbed into bed, trying to shake the strange feeling that had settled over her. But just as she was about to drift off, she heard it again, the doorbell. Her eyes snapped open. It wasn't her imagination. The clear, sharp ring echoed through the quiet house, louder this time. Her pulse quickened. The house was still dark, still empty, but the doorbell had rung once more. This time, Laura didn't hesitate. She grabbed her phone from the nightstand and texted her sister, Sarah, asking if she was playing a prank on her. No reply. Not that she had expected one. Sarah lived across town and had no reason to mess with her. She slid out of bed, her heart pounding in her chest, and crept down the hallway. Her hand hesitated over the doorknob, but she forced herself to open it again. She checked the peephole. Empty. The porch was still deserted, the same dark street stretching out in front of her. There was no one at all. This time, she wasn't sure whether to laugh or be terrified. She took a step back and, with a deep breath, closed the door once more, locking it behind her. But as she turned to head back to her bedroom, the doorbell rang again. It was a louder ring this time. Urgent, almost frantic. Laura froze. Her heart pounded in her chest and her hands trembled. She didn't know what to do. She glanced nervously toward the windows, but the blinds were drawn tight, leaving her with no view of the outside. The sound of the doorbell echoed through the quiet house like a call from a distant, unknown source. She could feel her skin crawl. No one had knocked. No one had been out there. So why did it feel so real? The sound was impossible to ignore, yet there was nothing to explain it. Her mind raced as she desperately tried to figure out what was going on. Was it some kind of malfunction? Was there something wrong with the doorbell? But everything seemed to be working fine when she checked earlier that day. With trembling hands, she texted Sarah again. "Are you messing with me? The doorbell keeps ringing, and there's no one out there." Sarah replied almost immediately, "No, I'm at work. Stop messing around. Maybe it's a glitch in the system." But that didn't make sense. There was no system with her doorbell. It was old, mechanical, not connected to anything electronic. It couldn't malfunction in this way. Her thoughts spun in circles as she stood at the door, trying to gather the courage to open it once more. Was someone out there playing a prank on her? Or was something much more sinister at play? She took a deep breath, gathered all her resolve, and opened the door once again. She looked through the peephole. Empty. But then she saw it. Out of the corner of her eye, a shadow moved. A dark figure stood at the edge of the yard, just beyond the reach of the porch light. It was too far away for her to make out any details, but the outline of a person was unmistakable. Laura's breath caught in her throat. She blinked hard, rubbed her eyes, but when she looked again, the figure was gone. Nothing but the empty street. Terrified now, Laura slammed the door shut and locked it with shaking hands. She backed away from the door, her heart racing as the silence pressed in on her. Her mind screamed for her to be logical, to reason this out, but there was no reasoning away the unease in her gut. She pulled her phone from her pocket and dialed 911, her voice shaking as she told the dispatcher that she thought someone was outside her home. They assured her that they would send someone right away. The minutes that followed felt like hours. Laura paced back and forth, glancing nervously at the door, her ears straining for any further sounds. The doorbell stayed silent, but the dread was unbearable. When the police arrived, they checked the yard, the street, and even the neighbors' homes. Nothing. No one. They assured Laura that it was likely some prank, but she knew what she had seen. She knew she wasn't imagining things. As the officers left, the doorbell rang again. Laura froze, her blood running cold. She turned slowly to the door. Her eyes searched the living room, the hallway, every corner of the apartment, but it was as empty as it had been for the past few hours. The police had seen nothing. No one had been there. The bell rang again, but this time she didn't even bother to check. Her legs were too weak to move, her thoughts spinning wildly as she backed away from the door, staring at the empty space between her and the cold, silent world outside. And just before she could close her eyes in exhaustion, she heard it once more, soft and distant, just beyond the door. "I'm here." Story 12, a loud thud from upstairs, even though there's no one there. It had been a peaceful Sunday afternoon when Emma decided to finally catch up on the household chores she had been putting off for the past few weeks. She just moved into her new home a few months ago, a charming 2-story house on the outskirts of town. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where the only sounds were the rustling of leaves or the occasional chirp of birds. The perfect place for a fresh start. After a long week of work, she was looking forward to the calm of a quiet Sunday. She tidied up the living room, started a load of laundry, and scrubbed the kitchen countertops, humming to herself as she worked. The house, still new and unfamiliar, felt warm and inviting. As she finished cleaning the kitchen, she paused to catch her breath. The house was still. Too still. There was no sound of traffic outside, no distant voices, just the hum of the refrigerator and the soft buzz of the ceiling fan overhead. It was almost eerie, but Emma didn't think too much of it. She had been living alone for a while now, and while the house had its quirks, nothing had ever felt out of the ordinary. But then it came. A loud thud, a deep, sudden bang that echoed from upstairs. Emma froze, her hand gripping the edge of the kitchen counter. The sound was so loud it seemed to shake the walls of the house. It was unmistakable. Something heavy had dropped or slammed against the floor above her. Her heart began to race, and her first thought was that perhaps one of the ceiling tiles had come loose, or maybe something had fallen off a shelf. But she quickly dismissed it. There was no reason for anything to fall. She hadn't moved anything upstairs in days. Taking a cautious step forward, Emma called out, her voice shaky. "Hello? Is someone up there?" Silence. No response. She took a few more steps into the hallway, her footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. The house seemed eerily quiet, the only sound now being her breath. She hesitated, unsure if she should go upstairs or simply ignore it. But her curiosity got the better of her. The thud had been so real, so loud, and it gnawed at her thoughts. Taking a deep breath, she slowly made her way up the stairs, each step creaking under her weight. The upstairs was dim, only a few rays of sunlight breaking through the curtains of the hallway. She glanced into the rooms as she passed, but everything looked normal. Nothing out of place. The thud echoed in her mind, and she walked towards the guest room at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and as she reached for the handle, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She pushed open the door. The room was empty. No one was there. But then, as she stepped further inside, something caught her eye. The corner of the room, the area near the window, was dark. The shadows there seemed to shift unnaturally, as if they were moving of their own accord. Her pulse quickened. She told herself it was just the angle of the light, that the shadows had played tricks on her, but something inside her screamed that something was wrong. The air felt colder now, the silence more oppressive. Maybe it was just the house settling, she muttered to herself, trying to calm her racing heart. But just as she turned to leave, she heard it again. A soft, dragging noise, like something being moved slowly across the floor, just behind her. Emma spun around, her eyes wide, but there was nothing there. She could feel her throat tighten, a chill creeping up her spine. Her breath caught in her throat as she glanced back toward the window, where the shadows seemed to pulse. Thud. The sound came again, louder this time, from directly above her. Emma's head snapped upward. She quickly left the room, rushing down the hall and toward the staircase. Her legs felt weak, her mind racing. What the hell was going on? She reached the bottom of the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound came again, a low, menacing thud, followed by a slow, dragging scrape. She looked up the stairs. They seemed impossibly high now, stretching upward into darkness. She could feel something pulling at her, a presence in the house. But when she turned back, the hallway was still empty. Emma didn't know what was happening, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't alone in the house. She rushed out the front door, slamming it behind her. The cold air hit her face, and for the first time that day, she felt like she could breathe again. She stood on the porch, trying to steady herself. It was quiet again, the house behind her still and silent. But as she glanced back at the house, she saw something in the upstairs window, a shadow, moving slowly from room to room, as if following her. A low whisper reached her ears, too quiet to make out, but it sounded almost amused. Emma didn't wait to find out what it was. She turned and ran to her car, driving as far from the house as she could, not looking back until the house was a distant memory. Weeks later, she would return to the house to collect her things. But when she stepped inside, it was different. The air was thick, heavy with a sense of dread. As she moved through the hallway, she noticed something new, the faintest of imprints in the dust on the floor. Footsteps leading from the stairs, and then she heard it again. A thud from upstairs. Emma didn't look back. She ran, knowing that whatever had been waiting for her inside that house, it wasn't finished with her yet. Story 13, Unexplained, knocks on the door in the middle of the night. It was just after midnight when the first knock came. Sarah had been lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The day had been long, and she'd hoped for a quiet, restful night to recharge, but the stillness of the house made her feel uneasy, as though something was off, just beyond her reach. Then she heard it. A soft knock, 3 quick taps, almost like someone testing the door, followed by a silence so deep it felt unnatural. Sarah's heart skipped. She lay there frozen, her eyes darting toward the bedroom door, which was slightly ajar. The house was completely still. There were no cars passing outside, no sounds from neighbors, just the silence of the night. She pushed herself up, her head spinning with questions. Was it a neighbor in need of help? Maybe someone lost? But why at this hour? The rational part of her told her it could be a prank, but the hair on the back of her neck stood up. It didn't feel right. Sarah slowly got out of bed, her footsteps muffled against the soft carpet. She tiptoed toward the living room, trying to remain as quiet as possible, her hand already on the doorknob. She paused for a moment, taking a deep breath before opening the door. Nothing. The hallway was dark, save for the dim light spilling in from the street lamp outside. Her eyes scanned the living room, the front door just a few steps away. There was no sign of anyone, nothing moved. The door was locked, as it always was. She sighed in relief, but as she was about to close the door, she heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. 3 more taps, just like before, this time louder and more insistent. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she turned toward the door, her body stiff with fear. The sound had come from the door itself, she was sure of it. She couldn't explain it, but it was almost like someone or something was standing right on the other side, waiting for her to answer. But who could it be? She lived alone. Her mind raced. Maybe it was a late-night delivery, though that made no sense. No one had been scheduled to come by. Maybe she had missed a call or a message, but the silence in her phone told her otherwise. As she hesitated, the knocking came again. 3 quick, deliberate raps on the door. She moved back cautiously, grabbing her phone and dialing her best friend, Laura, in a panic. "Laura," she whispered into the phone, "someone's knocking on my door, and it's the middle of the night. What should I do?" Her friend's voice came through the line, calm and reassuring. "Don't open the door, Sarah. Just call the cops and stay inside. Lock all the windows and doors." But before Sarah could even respond, the doorbell rang. Not a chime, but a single, piercing, loud ring that echoed throughout the house, filling the silence with an unsettling, almost mechanical tone. Her blood ran cold. She quickly hung up and dialed 911, her hands shaking as she tried to compose herself. The dispatcher answered, but all Sarah could do was whisper into the phone, "Please, someone is at my door. I'm home alone, and I don't know who it is." The dispatcher assured her that help was on the way and to stay inside and lock up until they arrived. But as Sarah huddled in the corner of her living room, clutching her phone, the knocking started again, this time harder, louder, almost as if it was shaking the doorframe. Thud, thud, thud. Each knock seemed to grow stronger, more forceful. It felt as though someone was pounding on the door with all their strength. Sarah's pulse raced. What did they want? Who was this? Why were they doing this to her? The darkness outside her door felt suffocating. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the knocking stopped. The silence returned, deep and deafening. Sarah held her breath, too afraid to move. Had they left? She dared not open the door to check. She waited. She listened. Nothing. But then a voice, a whisper, came from the other side of the door. Soft, faint. "I know you're in there." Her blood ran cold. Her mind went blank. She didn't know what to do. The voice was low, almost distorted, as though it was coming from the other side of a thick wall. The sound of her own heartbeat pounded in her ears as she backed away from the door, her knees weak with fear. The words echoed in her head, filling her thoughts with a sense of impending dread. "I know you're in there." Who could it be? Suddenly, the sound of sirens approached, growing louder, closer. Her pulse quickened with a mixture of relief and terror. Someone was coming. The police would be there soon, and she wouldn't be alone anymore. But just as the sirens reached their peak, the doorbell rang again. Once. Just once. And then, as if nothing had happened at all, everything went silent. The knocks, the voice, the ringing, they all stopped. When the police arrived, Sarah quickly opened the door, but the porch was empty. No one was there. The street was quiet, just the usual hum of the city in the distance. The officers checked the perimeter of the house, but there were no signs of anyone having been there. No footprints, no lingering presence. It was as though the whole incident had never occurred. The officers assured Sarah that it was likely a prank, though something in their voices suggested they weren't entirely convinced. But Sarah knew what she had heard. She had not imagined it. That night, after the police left and the house fell into an unnatural stillness, Sarah locked every door and window in the house. But as she climbed into bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The knocking had stopped, but the voice still echoed in her mind. "I know you're in there." And as she lay in bed, staring at the shadows on the walls, she couldn't help but wonder, who had been knocking? Who had known she was there? And more importantly, would they come back? Story 14, a strange smell filling the house with no source. Sophie had always prided herself on keeping a clean home. Everything had its place, every surface dusted, every corner swept. Her cozy little house in the suburbs was her sanctuary. She had moved in a few months ago, eager to start fresh after a tough breakup. The smell of fresh paint, new carpets, and the faint scent of lavender from her candles always filled the rooms with comfort. But one evening, as she was winding down after a long day, something changed. It started faintly, a strange odor wafting in from the kitchen. Sophie was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a book, the TV flickering in the background. At first, she thought it was something in the fridge. Maybe the old leftovers she had forgotten about. She stood up, stretching, and walked toward the kitchen. The smell grew stronger as she moved closer, but it wasn't food. It was something musty, like old damp earth. It had an unpleasant, almost sickly sweet undertone. Sophie frowned and checked the fridge. Nothing seemed out of place. No expired produce or rotten food. The smell wasn't coming from there at all. She walked over to the trash can, but it was empty. The scent lingered, hovering around her like a shadow. She turned around thinking it might be something from outside, maybe a plant or something in the yard. Something in the yard. She opened the back door and stuck her head out, but the cool evening air was fresh and clean. No unusual smells. She shut the door, growing uneasy. She moved through the house, checking every room. The smell seemed to be everywhere, wafting from nowhere in particular. It wasn't in the walls or under the furniture. It was as if the very air around her was tainted. Sophie felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a plumbing issue, or some kind of chemical spill she wasn't aware of. But the more she thought about it, the more unsettling it became. The house was new. There couldn't be anything like that. And yet, the smell persisted, making her feel trapped in her own home. As the evening wore on, the smell grew worse. The once faint odor had now overtaken the house, lingering in every room, seeping into her clothes, her skin. Sophie couldn't escape it. She opened the windows wide, hoping for a breeze to blow it away, but nothing changed. The air inside felt thick, heavy, and suffocating. It was as if the house itself had absorbed the odor and was now exhaling it into her lungs. Panic started to rise within her. Her mind raced with possibilities, each one more irrational than the last. Was it a gas leak? Was the house haunted? Had something died in the walls? She checked the basement, even though it had always been dry and free of pests. Nothing. No source. No explanation. As the clock struck midnight, Sophie gave up and called her best friend Emily, asking her to come over. Emily arrived within the hour, and Sophie was almost relieved to have someone else in the house. But when Emily stepped inside, her face went pale. "What is that smell?" Emily asked, her voice laced with concern. "I don't know," Sophie exclaimed, pacing nervously. "It's like it's coming from nowhere. I've checked everything. It's everywhere. I can't stand it." Emily went to the kitchen and sniffed the air, her face scrunching up in disgust. It's kind of like rot or something sweet. It's hard to describe." Sophie nodded, relieved to have someone confirm what she was experiencing. "I thought maybe I was just going crazy, but it's getting worse. I don't know what to do. It's like the house is poisoning the air." The two of them spent the next hour going through the house together. They checked every room, the vents, the attic, the basement again, anything that could explain the smell. But just like before, there was nothing to explain it. As they sat in the living room, defeated, the smell seemed to change. It became sharper, almost metallic. Sophie's head started to ache from the constant exposure, and she rubbed her temples, trying to focus. The air felt oppressive now, thick with something unnatural. It was as if the very walls of the house were closing in on her. Emily stared at the front door, then back at Sophie. This is strange, Sophie. Really strange." Sophie nodded, biting her lip. "I don't know what to do. I want to leave, but I don't want to leave the house. This is my home." But as she said it, the strangest thing happened. The The smell stopped, just like that. The house, which had been filled with a suffocating odor for hours, was now completely free of it. The air was suddenly fresh, the way it had been when Sophie first moved in. There was no trace of the musty, rotting scent. It was as if it had never been there at all. Sophie and Emily exchanged confused glances. "What the hell was that?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Sophie shook her head, feeling a chill creep up her spine. "I don't know. I can't explain it." They both looked around the room, but it was quiet, peaceful, as if nothing had happened. Still, the unsettling feeling lingered, like a presence they couldn't shake. Sophie knew that whatever the smell had been, it wasn't natural. Later that night, after Emily left, Sophie tried to go to sleep, but the strange feeling wouldn't leave her. The house seemed normal again, but the smell had been so real, so intense. She tossed and turned, unable to relax. Just before she finally drifted off to sleep, Sophie heard a faint sound, like a breath being exhaled. But she was alone. She quickly sat up, eyes wide in the dark room. Had she imagined it? Was it the wind? She listened again, but everything was silent. And then, in the distance, she thought she heard it again. A whisper. And with it, the faintest smell of something rotten. Story 15. A tap on the shoulder when you're sure no one is behind you. It had been one of those days. Julie was tired, overworked, and looking forward to nothing more than curling up in her bed and forgetting the world for a while. She had spent the entire afternoon at a conference for work, and now, as evening approached, she was finally on her way home. The subway car was almost empty, the soft hum of the tracks beneath her feet the only sound. The fluorescent lights above flickered occasionally, casting harsh shadows along the walls. Julie stood near the doors, one hand gripping the metal pole, her mind wandering as she watched the city pass by through the windows. She'd never been particularly fond of the subway, but it was the quickest way to get home, and right now she couldn't bring herself to care. The train screeched as it slowed down, and Julie glanced over her shoulder to see the next station coming up. It was the last stop before hers, a quiet area where few people boarded or disembarked. The car was nearly empty, except for one other passenger, an older man, hunched over with his face buried in a newspaper, sitting on the opposite end of the car. Julie shifted her weight, trying to get comfortable. The air in the subway car felt stale, and the flickering lights above her only added to the oppressive atmosphere. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to zone out and ignore the strange feeling creeping up her spine. It was as though something wasn't right, like she was being watched, even though the car was nearly deserted. When she opened her eyes again, she saw something that made her freeze. In the reflection of the subway door, she saw her own reflection, of course. But there was something else, a faint, almost imperceptible shadow just behind her. The reflection wasn't clear enough to make out details, but it seemed like someone was standing right there. Her breath caught in her throat, and she quickly turned her head. There was no one behind her. The subway car was empty, just as it had been when she last checked. Still, the feeling lingered. It was as though someone was standing just out of sight, watching her every move. Julie swallowed hard and tried to shake off the unsettling sensation. She even looked at the man at the other end of the car, but he hadn't moved, still engrossed in his newspaper. She turned her attention back to the door, trying to steady her nerves, telling herself it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But then it happened, a soft tap, right on her shoulder. Julie's heart stopped, her entire body freezing in shock. Her first instinct was to turn around, but something held her back. She slowly looked over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the empty space behind her. Nothing. The car was still as empty as it had been seconds ago. No one was standing behind her. There was no one even close. She felt a chill wash over her, her breath quickening. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and her hands gripped the pole tighter. Maybe it was someone trying to get by, she thought. Maybe I didn't notice. But she knew that wasn't true. The tap had come too clearly, too distinctly. It wasn't a bump from the car lurching or someone brushing past her. It was deliberate, and it was impossible. Julie's mind raced, trying to rationalize it. I'm just tired, she thought, trying to convince herself. I'm imagining things. But then, the tap came again. A second, more insistent tap on her shoulder. Julie's pulse shot up, her stomach sinking. This time, she didn't even look around. She couldn't. Something inside her screamed to keep her eyes forward, to not acknowledge whatever presence was behind her. She couldn't explain why, but the feeling of dread was overwhelming. The tap wasn't a mistake. Someone or something was there. The train continued its journey, its hum now a distant, almost hollow sound in her ears. Julie's heart thudded against her chest, each beat loud and frantic. She wanted to look again, to turn around and face whatever it was, but she was terrified. She could feel the presence more now, as though it were right behind her, standing just at her back, close enough to reach out and touch her again. The doors to the train car slid open at the next station, and Julie didn't think, she just moved. In one swift motion, she bolted for the door, pushing her way through the crowd that had just boarded, not bothering to look back. She nearly stumbled down the stairs as she rushed onto the platform, feeling the air rush past her as though she were escaping something far worse than a late-night subway ride. Julie stood on the platform, her chest heaving, her eyes scanning the empty train. There was no one in the car, not a soul. The man with the newspaper had already gotten off at the previous stop, and the train doors closed as it prepared to depart. But as the train pulled away, she could have sworn, just for a moment, that she saw something. In the window of the car, reflected in the glass as the train sped away, was a figure. No face, no distinct shape, just the faint outline of someone standing behind her, almost blending into the shadows. Julie backed away, the hair on her neck standing straight up. She wasn't sure if what she saw was real or just her mind playing tricks, but the lingering sense of someone being too close stayed with her as she walked toward the exit of the station. When she finally made it home that night, she bolted every door, locked every window, and stood in the middle of her living room, trying to calm herself down. She wasn't sure what had happened on the subway, but one thing was for sure, she wasn't going to ride it again after dark. And yet, as she sat down on her couch, she couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, somewhere, she wasn't alone. A tap on the shoulder, a presence behind her, and no one to explain it. Story 16, the power going out, and you hear breathing, but no one else is around. It was supposed to be a quiet evening. Emma had just settled in on the couch, her blanket wrapped around her like a cocoon, and the soft hum of the TV filling the silence of her apartment. The storm outside had started hours ago, its thunder rumbling in the distance, but Emma didn't mind. It was peaceful in its own way. She had the apartment to herself for the weekend, and for the first time in a while, she had a chance to relax. The storm intensified as the night wore on. The wind howled against the windows, rattling the frames, but Emma barely noticed. She was too engrossed in the show on her screen. That was, until the lights flickered. It wasn't unusual for the power to go out during storms, so Emma didn't think much of it. She reached for the remote to pause her show, but before she could, the lights blinked once more and then went completely dark. For a moment, she sat in stunned silence, her eyes adjusting to the sudden blackness. The only sound was the distant rumble of thunder and the patter of rain against the windows. "Great," she muttered under her breath. She fumbled for her phone on the coffee table to check if there were any updates about the power outage. No messages. No notifications. She stood up, making her way through the dark apartment toward the hallway. Her phone's flashlight illuminated the space around her, casting long, eerie shadows along the walls. As she passed the living room window, she looked out at the storm, but the rain had made it difficult to see anything. "Power's probably out everywhere," she muttered, trying to calm her nerves. The storm sounded worse outside than it felt in her cozy apartment, but the darkened space made her feel a bit uneasy. She flipped on a flashlight and started searching for candles, hoping to at least have some light. The only thing she could hear was the soft pattering of the rain. But then, something else caught her attention. A faint sound. A breath. It was soft at first, barely audible above the wind and rain, but it grew clearer. A slow, steady in-out like someone was standing in the room with her, breathing deeply. It wasn't her own breath. It was too rhythmic, too controlled. It was like someone was standing just out of sight, just behind her, waiting. Emma froze. Her heart skipped a beat as the breath grew louder, closer. It was almost like it was coming from just behind her. She turned quickly, her flashlight beam scanning the hallway, the bathroom, and the dark corners of the apartment, but no one was there. She stood motionless, her breath catching in her throat. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. She swallowed hard and started to move back toward the living room, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The breath followed her, soft, slow, unmistakable. Someone was there, someone was with her. She stumbled back into the living room, casting the light across every corner, searching desperately for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Just the stillness of the apartment and the relentless sound of the storm outside. It's the storm, Emma thought to herself, trying to rationalize. It's just the wind making noises. Maybe it's the house settling. But then the breathing came again. This time, it was unmistakable, clear, loud, and coming from right behind her. She spun around. Nothing. The apartment was still. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She pressed her back to the wall, the flashlight illuminating the space around her like some kind of shield. But nothing. No shadows, no movement, just the eerie quiet of the storm. She took a slow step backward toward the front door, her body frozen in a state of terror. It's all in my head. It has to be, she told herself. But the weight of the breathing, the sensation of someone close by, was overwhelming. The room suddenly felt colder, and the breath sounded even closer. Her ears rang with the sound, like a whisper too soft to catch, yet too real to ignore. And then, as if on cue, the sound of the door creaked. Emma's flashlight swung toward the door in a blur, her body jerking in panic. The door was slightly ajar. Her pulse raced, and for a moment, she was frozen to the spot. She had locked the door. She was sure of it. No one else had keys to her apartment, and she hadn't heard anything from the hallway. But someone had opened it. Someone was here. The breathing, closer now, seemed to be coming from right in front of her. She felt it more than she heard it, a pressure in the air, cold and suffocating. Her phone's flashlight flickered, casting strange shadows against the walls. She rushed toward the door, her mind in a frantic blur, her hands shaking as she pushed the door open wide. The hallway outside was empty, just the dim light from the emergency exit sign casting a faint glow. The breathing stopped. Everything was silent. The wind howled outside and the rain pounded against the windows, but in the apartment, the world was still. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She slowly stepped into the hallway, checking every corner, every shadow, but she couldn't see anyone. The power was still out. No one was in the apartment. Yet she could still feel it, an unsettling presence, as though someone was standing just behind her, watching, waiting. She took another step forward, the silence oppressive, and then she heard the faintest whisper. "I'm still here." The words chilled her to the bone, too clear and too close. She spun around again, but this time, she didn't hesitate. She bolted toward the stairs, the door slamming behind her as she ran. And as she reached the street, the lights of the city flickered back on, illuminating the world around her. But the feeling remained. The suffocating, oppressive presence that had been in her apartment, the whisper she couldn't escape. And no matter how far she ran, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still breathing, still waiting, just out of sight. Story 17, seeing movement from the corner of your eye, but nothing when you turn to look. It was late when Lily arrived home, the streetlights casting long, flickering shadows across the sidewalk. She'd been out with friends, laughing, chatting, and for a brief moment, everything had felt normal. But now, as she stepped into the quiet of her apartment complex, something felt off. The hallway was darker than usual, the lights above flickering intermittently. The building had always been a little rundown, but Lily never minded. She was used to the creaks and groans of the old structure, the way the floors would occasionally moan as if the building itself were breathing. But tonight it felt different, like something was just slightly out of place. She fumbled for her keys, the sound of her footsteps echoing off the walls as she walked toward her door. The building was eerily silent, no neighbors chatting, no doors opening or closing. Lily paused, feeling a strange unease ripple down her spine. She glanced over her shoulder at the dark hallway behind her, but there was no one there. She shook her head, muttering to herself. "Get it together, Lily," she whispered, pressing the key into the lock. The door opened with a soft click, and she stepped into her apartment, closing the door behind her. She dropped her purse on the couch and kicked off her shoes, letting out a relieved sigh. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in the familiar sight of her furniture, the dim glow from the lamp on the table. She walked toward the kitchen, absently turning on the kettle for tea. But as she moved, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was the same sensation she'd had when she first entered the building, like she wasn't completely alone, like someone was watching her. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A shadow, a movement, just at the edge of her vision, as if something had darted across the room. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She quickly turned to look, but there was nothing. Nothing but the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the soft buzz of the light overhead. It had been a brief flicker, nothing solid, but it was enough to make her pulse race. It was just your imagination, she told herself, swallowing hard. Maybe it was a car passing by or a trick of the light. Lily shook her head, trying to push the thought from her mind. She reached for a mug, hands trembling slightly as she poured the hot water into it. But then, the movement came again. It was more distinct this time, right in her peripheral vision, just on the edge of the room. Something large, darker than the shadows around it, moving quickly across the hallway that led to her bedroom. Her breath caught in her throat. Again, she turned sharply, her eyes sweeping the space, but there was nothing. The hallway was empty, the door to her bedroom ajar, but nothing inside. The silence was deafening, pressing in on her from all sides. "You're being paranoid, Lily. It's just the house settling," she tried to reason with herself. She glanced at the clock, almost midnight. She was tired, probably imagining things after a long day. But as she reached for the kettle again, she saw it once more. A blur of movement, this time across the dark hallway near her bedroom door. It was faster than before, darting just out of view, too quick to be anything normal. Her heart skipped a beat, and this time, she didn't turn. She stood frozen, her breath coming faster now, a cold sweat forming on the back of her neck. She couldn't move, couldn't even blink, because somewhere in her mind, she knew. It was no trick of the light. There was something there, something moving, something that shouldn't be. Lily's eyes flicked to the doorway of her bedroom, and she could have sworn she saw a shadow stretch across the frame, just barely visible. It was thin, almost too thin to be real. This isn't happening, she thought, her mind racing. But the movement persisted, quick flashes just out of her direct line of sight. She felt a chill creep up her spine, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. It was as if whatever was there was teasing her, showing itself only in the periphery, like it knew she would turn to look and it would vanish again. Her hands trembled as she grabbed her phone from the kitchen counter, the screen lighting up as she unlocked it. She stared at the dim light for a moment, trying to calm herself. But the strange sensation in the back of her mind wouldn't go away. It felt as though something was circling her, always staying just out of sight, always remaining just beyond her reach. She turned, staring into the hallway one more time, but it was empty. No shadows, no movement. But then, just as she was about to convince herself it was nothing, it happened again. A figure, distinct now, stepped into her peripheral vision, dark and tall. It was almost human, but not quite, its shape unsettlingly wrong. It hovered just outside her bedroom, then darted back into the shadows. Lily's breath caught in her throat. This time, she didn't look away. She couldn't. Her eyes locked onto the hallway, waiting, dreading the next movement. And for a moment, everything went still. No more flickers, no more shadows, just silence. Lily didn't wait another second. She grabbed her phone, her purse, and bolted out of the apartment, not daring to look behind her. She ran down the stairs, past the darkened hallways, and out into the night, her pulse pounding in her ears. As she reached the street, she couldn't shake the feeling that, even then, something was watching her. The shadow she had seen, whatever it was still there, just out of sight, moving in the corners of her mind. And she knew, deep down, that it would never stop watching her. Story 18. Strange noises coming from the attic or basement when no one is there. Anna had just moved into the old house on Elm Street. The place was large, with creaking floors and high arched ceilings that seemed to stretch forever. It was the perfect space for her fresh start, away from the noise of the city and the bustle of daily life. She had always dreamed of living in an old home, a place with history, charm, and a few quirks. But there was something about this house that made her uneasy. It wasn't the house itself. The rooms were beautiful, filled with natural light, and there was something comforting about its age. It was the silence. The house was always silent, even when it shouldn't be. And over the past few weeks, that silence had started to be broken by something else: the sounds. It began one evening when Anna was settling into her new living room after a long day of unpacking. The wind outside was fierce, howling through the trees, causing the windows to rattle. But then, as she sat on the couch, the sound broke through the wind, a soft, rhythmic thumping coming from above her. The attic. Anna tried to brush it off, thinking it was just the house settling, but the sound persisted. It wasn't random. It was too deliberate. Thump, thump, thump. A steady rhythm, like someone was walking around up there, pacing back and forth. Her heart began to race. No one had been up in the attic, and she was certain the space wasn't accessible from inside. It was one of those old houses with an attic hatch that had long since been sealed off. So how could someone be up there? She stood up, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, and walked toward the staircase that led up to the attic. The sound stopped abruptly as she reached the bottom of the stairs. She paused, holding her breath. Everything was silent again, save for the wind outside. The door to the attic hatch was just as she had left it, locked, the old wooden frame sealed tight. But the moment her hand brushed the door, the thumping started again. Louder this time, more insistent, as if whatever or whoever was up there knew she was standing right beneath it. She quickly backed away from the stairs, her pulse pounding. Her mind raced through possibilities. Animals? A rodent in the walls? No, it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. She decided to ignore it for now, telling herself that it was just the house settling, that she was imagining things. After all, it was an old place, and the wind outside was strong. But the noises didn't stop. Each night, as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, the thumping would start. It was always the same. Thump, thump, thump. A steady pace, like someone walking above her head. One evening, she couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed a flashlight and made her way to the attic door once again. This time, she was determined to figure out what was going on. She unlocked the door, her hand shaking as she reached for the old latch. The moment the door creaked open, the noise stopped. Silence. But it wasn't a comforting silence. It was unnerving, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She climbed the ladder into the attic, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The space was dusty, filled with old furniture covered in sheets, forgotten relics of the house's past. There was nothing there. No sign of any animals. No debris. Just the eerie silence. Her breath fogged in the cool air as she scanned the room, her flashlight casting long shadows across the cluttered floor. And then she heard it. A soft scraping sound. It was coming from the far corner of the attic, where an old wooden chest sat. The chest had been there since the first time she'd climbed up, but it had never moved. Now she could hear something scraping against the wood, slow and deliberate. Her hands trembled as she stepped closer, the sound growing louder with every step. She shone the flashlight on the chest, the beam flickering in and out of focus. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest as she reached for the lid. But before she could touch it, the scraping stopped, and then a whisper. "Go back." The voice was faint, barely audible, but it was there. She jerked back, the flashlight falling from her hands, and the beam illuminated the room in a chaotic, jumbled mess. There was nothing in the corner. The chest was still. The room was silent once again. Anna's mind raced. She had to be imagining it. There was no one up here. No one had been up here for years. But the voice, "Go back," echoed in her mind, clear as day. She quickly scrambled to her feet, grabbing the flashlight from the floor and backing toward the ladder. She didn't look back, not once. She climbed down as quickly as she could and slammed the attic door shut behind her, locking it again. That night, the sounds didn't come. The house was silent, too silent. Anna lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. She tried to convince herself it was all just a trick of the mind, the creaks and groans of an old house settling into its foundation. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. The following morning, Anna called a contractor to check the attic. Maybe there was something she had missed. Maybe a rodent had made its way in or a pipe had burst, causing the noise. The contractor arrived, went up into the attic, and came back down in a matter of minutes. His face was pale, his voice shaky. "There's nothing up there," he said, his hands twitching at his sides. "Not a single thing. The attic's completely empty." Anna nodded slowly, trying to mask the creeping feeling of dread that was rising in her chest. But as the contractor left, he gave her one last piece of advice. "If you hear those noises again, don't go up there. Some things are better left alone." That night, the thumping started again. But this time, Anna didn't go up. She stayed downstairs, trembling in the dark, her heart pounding. And as she listened to the rhythmic thump, thump, thump above her, she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been in the attic, or whatever still lingered there, was waiting for her to make the mistake of opening the door once more. Story 19. The sudden coldness in a room when the rest of the house is warm. Megan had always loved her home. Nestled on the edge of the small town, it was a charming two-story house with old wooden floors and cozy rooms filled with sunlight. It was the perfect sanctuary after a long day, and with winter settling in, she was looking forward to curling up with a blanket by the fireplace, a book in hand, and a warm cup of tea. The evening had started like any other. Megan had spent the afternoon cleaning, tidying up, and making the house feel inviting. After dinner, she cleaned up the kitchen, turned on the fireplace in the living room, and then decided to finish reading a novel she'd started earlier in the week. It was a peaceful, quiet night, until it wasn't. It started in the hallway. She had just set her book down on the couch when she felt it, an unexpected chill that made her skin prickle. Megan furrowed her brow and looked around, half expecting the draft from the old windows to be the cause. But no, the windows were tightly shut, and the fireplace was crackling merrily, sending warmth through the room. The rest of the house was perfectly cozy. She stood up, feeling the coldness intensify, and walked toward the hallway. As she passed the door to the guest bedroom, the temperature dropped even more. She shivered and rubbed her arms, wondering if something had gone wrong with the heating system. But when she reached the living room again, the warmth returned and everything felt normal. Her curiosity piqued. Megan walked back toward the guest room. The coldness was unmistakable now, sharp and biting, as though an icy wind had crept into the walls and settled there. Her breath fogged the air as she approached the door. The room was quiet, the door slightly ajar. Megan hesitated. She had never felt a temperature shift like this before. Something about it didn't sit right with her. She pushed the door open. The moment she stepped inside, it was as if she had walked into a completely different world. The cold hit her like a wall, so intense it made her gasp. The room was freezing, far colder than the rest of the house. The air was thick, oppressive, and the feeling of it wrapped around her like a weight. Her breath came out in misty clouds, and her skin tingled uncomfortably. But there was no draft. No reason for it to be this cold. The windows in the room were closed. The curtains, heavy and thick, hung still, undisturbed by any wind. The room, once a calm and peaceful guest room, now felt wrong, as if it were somehow separated from the rest of the house, as though it were trapped in time, existing in a parallel space of frigid, unrelenting cold. Megan stepped back toward the door, her heart beginning to race. She felt a shiver that wasn't just from the cold, but from an overwhelming sense of unease. She quickly turned to leave the room, but something caught her attention. A faint sound, like a whisper, coming from the far corner of the room. She froze. The whisper was too soft to make out, but it was there, almost as if someone, or something, was speaking to her from the shadows. Megan's breath caught in her throat, and she spun toward the sound, her pulse pounding in her ears. There was nothing there, no movement, no one in the corner of the room. But the cold lingered. She couldn't take it anymore. She rushed to the door, her hands shaking as she reached for the handle. But as she touched it, she noticed something strange. Something was tugging at her. It was subtle at first, like a pressure on her chest, pulling her toward the room, as if the space itself didn't want her to leave. Megan yanked the door open, stepping back into the warmth of the hallway. She stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, her body still chilled from the room. The air in the hallway felt almost suffocatingly warm, like she'd stepped into the safety of sunlight after being trapped in the dark for too long. She slammed the door shut behind her, and as soon as she did, the coldness in the guest room seemed to dissipate, vanishing without a trace. Shaken, Megan stood in the hallway, trying to calm herself. What had just happened? Why had the room been so cold? She could still feel the lingering chill in her bones, even though the warmth of the house surrounded her now. That night, Megan went to bed with the covers pulled up tight around her, trying to ignore the unnerving sensation that the cold still lingered in the house, like a shadow waiting for the right moment to return. The next day, Megan went to the guest room again. She needed to make sure it wasn't something she had imagined. But when she opened the door, the room was as it always had been, normal, warm even. But she couldn't forget what had happened. Every time she passed by that door, the unease would return. She found herself avoiding the room altogether, leaving the door shut and locked, as if she could keep whatever had been there out. The cold never came back. But Megan knew, deep down, that the next time it did, it might not leave so easily. Story 20. An eerie, soft voice coming from the TV when it's turned off. Clara had always been a fan of quiet evenings at home. After long days at work, she looked forward to nothing more than sinking into her couch, turning on the TV, and escaping into her favorite shows. Her apartment was small, but cozy, just enough space for her to unwind. It was her sanctuary, a place where nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary. One night, after finishing her dinner, Clara settled in front of the TV, the soft hum of the machine filling the otherwise silent room. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, its hands creeping toward midnight. It had been a long, exhausting week, and Clara felt the pull of sleep already. She turned off the lamp beside her and flicked on her favorite crime drama. But as the opening credits rolled, her mind drifted. She was tired, too tired to follow the story, so she let herself relax, her eyes slowly closing. Before she knew it, the show had ended. Clara hadn't realized she'd fallen asleep, but now she awoke with a jolt, her eyes snapping open. The room was dark, except for the soft glow of the TV, which was still on, but the screen was black. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't left the TV on, had she? Confused, Clara grabbed the remote and clicked the power button. The TV turned off with a soft click, plunging the room into complete darkness. She sat in the stillness for a moment, trying to shake off the lingering fog of sleep. But then she heard it. A voice, soft, almost imperceptible. Clara. Her blood ran cold. The voice wasn't loud, but it was clear, too clear. It was coming from the TV, even though the screen was dark, the device powered off. She froze, her fingers gripping the remote so tightly her knuckles whitened. The voice had been gentle, like a whisper, but it carried a weight that made her skin prickle. She slowly reached for the power button again, pressing it harder this time, but the TV didn't respond. "Clara," the voice repeated, now a little clearer, though still just a whisper. "Come closer." Her breath caught in her throat, the words sending a chill crawling down her spine. She knew she hadn't imagined it. The voice had been real, disturbingly real. She hadn't heard it wrong. The TV screen was still black, but the voice persisted. "Clara, I'm waiting for you." Something in the way the voice pronounced her name made her stomach churn. It was too familiar, too personal, but not quite right. The way the name echoed, like it was calling from a far-off place, made her shiver with dread. She stood, instinctively stepping back from the TV. Her feet felt heavy, and for a moment she wondered if she was still dreaming. Maybe it was just some strange glitch, some audio malfunction from the show. That had to be it, right? But as she turned to leave the room, the voice came again, louder this time, as though the TV were trying to reach her. "Clara, don't leave." She froze in place. The words hung in the air, and Clara's pulse quickened. This was no malfunction. She could feel it in her bones. Something was wrong. Without thinking, she hurried to the door, her hands shaking as she yanked it open, desperate to escape. But as she stepped into the hallway, the voice called out again. This time, it was coming from the hallway itself. "Clara." She whirled around, her breath ragged. The voice seemed to echo, now coming from all directions, from the very walls themselves. Her eyes darted back to the living room, where the TV sat, still dark, silent. "Clara? Come back?" Her legs felt like lead as she stumbled back toward the room, her mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. She hadn't imagined it. The voice was there, right in front of her, as if it had been waiting for her. It wasn't just the TV anymore, it was everywhere. She stepped into the living room, her eyes darting nervously, expecting to see something, anything that would explain what was happening. But there was nothing. The TV screen remained black. The room was still. She could hear the faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen and the distant rumble of traffic outside, but nothing else. But then something made her stop. A soft flicker, like a shadow moving across the room. And then a figure, a shape, appeared on the TV screen. It was just a blur at first, but as she watched, it began to sharpen, taking form. It was a shadowy outline of a person, their face obscured, but their presence unmistakable. And then the voice came again, clearer than ever, rising from the depths of the screen. "Clara, you finally come." Clara's breath caught in her throat as she watched, paralyzed with fear. The figure on the screen slowly reached out, its hands stretching toward her, and just as suddenly as it appeared, the TV flickered violently, the screen crackling with static before shutting off completely. Clara stood there, her heart pounding, every muscle in her body frozen in place. The silence that followed was deafening, but the weight of the moment lingered, hanging over her like a dark cloud. She slowly turned and walked out of the room, not daring to look back. She couldn't explain what had just happened, but she knew one thing for certain. Something had been waiting for her. Something that had been watching her, calling her, from beyond the screen. And she wasn't sure if it was gone for good. Story 21. A phone alarm going off at odd times with no explanation. Elise had always been a creature of habit. She worked as a freelance graphic designer, which meant long hours at her desk, working late into the night or early mornings to meet deadlines. To keep her on track, she relied heavily on her phone's alarm, set to go off at precise times to remind her to take breaks, stretch, or switch tasks. It had become part of her routine, so much so that she could almost hear the alarm in her sleep. But then, one night, it changed. It was around 2 a.m. when Elise was deep in her work, the glow of her laptop screen the only light in her small apartment. She had just finished a design draft and was taking a brief moment to stretch her stiff muscles when it happened. Her phone buzzed loudly from across the room. She glanced at the time. 2:07 a.m. It was an odd time for her usual alarms, but it didn't seem entirely out of place. Maybe it was a reminder she had set earlier, one that she had forgotten about. But when she picked up the phone and looked at the screen, there was no indication of an alarm. No app, no notification, nothing. Confused, she shut off the alarm and went back to her work, brushing it off as a mistake, a glitch. But the next night, it happened again. This time, it was 3:17 a.m. The alarm went off again, loud and insistent, vibrating the phone in her hand. It woke her up from a deep concentration on her design work. She picked it up, once again expecting to see an alarm or reminder, but there was nothing. No app running, no reason for the alarm to have gone off. Her phone was just silent, except for the buzzing noise it made. This time, Elise felt uneasy. It was too random to be a glitch. She powered down her phone for the night, hoping that might fix it. But the next night, the alarm went off again. 5:42 a.m. Her heart skipped a beat. She had set her alarms for earlier in the day, but 5:42 a.m. wasn't one of them. She was exhausted, still bleary-eyed, and just barely awake when the phone buzzed loudly, pulling her from her half-dream state. Again, she checked the screen, expecting an explanation, but found nothing. The phone was silent except for the blaring alarm. This time, Elise's anxiety began to mount. The randomness of it was starting to get to her. Why did it keep happening at different times, and why was there no record of it? She had done everything she could think of to fix it, turned off alarms, checked app settings, rebooted her phone, but nothing worked. And then it got worse. One evening, she was working late as usual, eyes strained from staring at the screen for hours. The apartment was silent, except for the quiet hum of her laptop and the soft buzz of the refrigerator. The clock on the wall showed 10:43 p.m. Without warning, her phone buzzed loudly. Elise's stomach dropped. She had learned by now not to expect any answers when she checked it, but this time, something was different. The buzzing didn't stop. It continued, a steady, rhythmic vibration that made her skin crawl. She picked up the phone, and there it was again. No app, no alarm, nothing. And then the phone screen flickered. Elise's breath caught in her throat. For just a split second, the screen flashed a strange symbol. It looked like a triangle with an eye in the center, but it was gone before she could fully process it. She stared at her phone, frozen. The alarm still ringing in her ears, but now there was a deep, foreboding sense that something wasn't right. The phone continued to vibrate, though the screen remained dark. Elise quickly threw it onto the couch and rushed to the kitchen to get some water, her heart hammering in her chest. What was going on? Was her phone malfunctioning, or was something more sinister happening? She tried to shake it off, telling herself it was just a malfunction, a glitch in the system. She powered off the phone again, turned it back on, and even uninstalled any apps she didn't need. But deep down, she felt that something was wrong. Then the phone went silent. It was almost like nothing had happened. But the next night, when she was working at her desk, it happened again. This time, Elise didn't even look at the time. The alarm went off. Sharp, shrill, and then it stopped just as suddenly. When she checked her phone, it was there, staring at her with a new message notification. Hesitant, she tapped the notification, wondering if it was from a friend or a reminder that she had set earlier. But when the screen opened, there was only one line of text. It's time. Elise's blood ran cold. She tried to turn off the phone again, but it wouldn't let her. The screen went dark, then flickered, showing the same symbol she'd seen before, the triangle with the eye. She threw the phone down on the floor in panic, stepping back from it as it vibrated incessantly. When she finally dared to pick it up again, the alarm had stopped. The phone was eerily quiet. The next day, Elise packed up her things and left her apartment. She couldn't explain the strange happenings with the phone, but she couldn't stay there anymore. She tried everything she could think of to stop it, but nothing worked. The alarms had been random, eerie, and now they felt like a warning. She moved into a new place, far away from the strange occurrences, and turned off the notifications on her new phone. She never saw the symbol again, and the alarms didn't return. But sometimes, when she lay in bed late at night, alone in her new apartment, she would hear a soft, faint buzzing coming from her phone. Just faint enough to make her wonder if it was the wind, or the fridge, or something far, far worse. Story 22. The unsettling feeling that you forgot to check one locked door or window. Hannah had always been meticulous. She was the type of person who double-checked everything, her keys, her bags, her work. It wasn't just a habit, it was a way of life. Especially when it came to her apartment. After a long day at work, she'd return home, unlock the door, and immediately begin her routine. She locked every window, checked the door locks twice, and ensured that everything was secure. But one night, as the clock ticked toward midnight, something was different. It had been a long week. The kind of week that drained you in ways you didn't even realize. Exhausted from work, Hannah had come home late, as usual, fed her cat, and began her evening ritual, locking up her apartment and preparing for bed. After walking through the familiar steps of securing her home, she crawled into bed, pulling the blankets up to her chin. The apartment was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the faint tapping of rain against the windows. Her eyes fluttered closed, and her mind began to drift. But as soon as she started to relax, a thought tugged at her mind. A fleeting, nagging feeling that something was off. She couldn't put her finger on it at first, but then it struck her. Did I check the kitchen window? It was an odd thought. She was certain she had. She always did. Every window. Every lock. It was a habit she'd developed to feel safe. But there it was again, the thought, insistent and irritating. Did I check the kitchen window? She sat up in bed, her heart suddenly racing. She glanced around her dimly lit apartment, the silence heavy in the air. Something felt wrong, something she couldn't explain. It was the kind of feeling that crept up your spine, making the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. Hannah shook her head, trying to push the thought away. She had locked everything. She always did. But despite her reassurances, the feeling wouldn't go away. She got out of bed, her bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. The clock on the wall read 12:15 a.m. It was late, but the thought of leaving the window unlocked was unsettling. She moved toward the kitchen. Her apartment was small, only a few rooms, but each step felt like it echoed through the empty space. As she reached the kitchen, she stopped at the window, standing just a few feet from it, trying to gather the courage to look. The curtains hung still, the moonlight barely making it through the rain-splattered glass. The window, which she had locked without a second thought hours ago, now seemed vulnerable, as if something had changed. Hannah slowly reached out and grasped the handle, her fingers trembling slightly. She turned it. The window was locked. A wave of relief washed over her, but it didn't last long. That nagging feeling still lingered, like a shadow in the corner of her mind. She checked the window. Everything was fine. But now, a new thought crept in. One that was even worse. What if it wasn't the kitchen window I forgot to check? Her pulse quickened. She glanced around the room again, trying to think of where else she might have overlooked. Was it the back door? Had she checked it? Was she sure it was locked? Her gaze darted toward the hallway leading to her bedroom. The apartment felt bigger now, emptier, as if the walls were closing in on her. She walked down the hallway, her footsteps hesitant, and stood in front of the back door. The door that led to the small balcony, the one that she always locked. She reached out, touching the handle, her fingers moving slowly, almost mechanically. Click. It was locked. Just as it should be. But as she stepped away from the door, her eyes landed on the closet. The closet she had left open earlier that evening. She couldn't remember locking it, but she was certain she had. Wasn't she? The thought was maddening. She had always been so careful. She couldn't have forgotten to lock it. But the more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that something was off. She walked toward the closet, her breath shallow, her pulse racing. The door creaked slightly as she pushed it open. Inside, there was nothing unusual, just clothes hanging on the rod, her shoes neatly lined up on the floor. But then, in the corner of the closet, she noticed something she hadn't before. A shadow. A dark shape that seemed to shift in the dim light, just barely visible in the corner of the room. Hannah froze, her eyes locked on the shape. Her breath caught in her throat. It was as if someone was hiding there, barely out of view. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stepped back, the thought of checking every room in the apartment suddenly too overwhelming to handle. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She had double-checked everything, hadn't she? The kitchen window, the back door, the closet. But now the entire apartment felt off, like it was harboring something she couldn't see, something waiting just beyond the edge of her awareness. She backed out of the closet, closing the door quietly behind her. Her legs were unsteady, her mind racing with paranoia. She had checked everything, but the feeling still gnawed at her. Something had been left undone. And as she lay back down in bed, the thought circled endlessly in her mind. The silence was unbearable. She lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was out of place in her otherwise perfect, secure home. And as the hours ticked by, one thing became abundantly clear. It didn't matter how many times she checked. That unsettling feeling would never leave her. Story 23, a knock at your door, but you never hear anyone leave afterward. It had been a long day for Mia. The kind of day that left her exhausted, her mind tired from endless meetings and emails. She was grateful for the peace of her apartment, her sanctuary from the world. The apartment was small but cozy, and it offered a quiet retreat where she could recharge. Mia had just settled into her favorite chair, a steaming cup of tea in hand, when the knock came. Knock. Knock. It was a quick, sharp knock that broke through the stillness of the room, sending a shiver down her spine. She paused, confused. No one ever visited her unannounced. Her friends always texted before dropping by, and the delivery services always called when they were near. She set her cup down on the table and stood up, walking toward the door. As she approached, she glanced through the peephole, but there was no one there. Her stomach flipped. Maybe it was just a neighbor. Perhaps someone had mistaken her door for theirs. Cautiously, she opened the door a crack, poking her head out to look around. The hallway outside was empty, no one in sight. Her breath released in a quiet sigh of relief. Must have been a mistake, she thought. She was about to close the door when she noticed something strange, a small, folded piece of paper resting on the doormat, as if placed there intentionally. Mia's curiosity got the better of her. She bent down and picked up the note, unfolding it carefully. The handwriting was neat, but the words made her blood run cold. "I'm here." A chill ran through her as she stood there, the note now in her hand. Who would leave something like this? Who would come to her door, knock, and leave without a trace? 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind, but none made sense. Mia quickly closed the door, locking it behind her. She checked the peephole once more, but again, there was no one in the hallway. She stood there for a long moment, the note still clutched in her hand. The silence in the apartment felt thick, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Mia tried to shake off the unease gnawing at her. Maybe it was a prank, maybe it was a mistake, but something deep in her gut told her that it was anything but that. She decided to try and distract herself, returning to her tea and the book she had been reading. But the sense of unease wouldn't leave her. Every noise in the apartment, every creak of the floor, every hum of the refrigerator sounded too loud. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer than it should. She glanced at the clock. It had been over an hour since the knock. The apartment was still. The silence, which should have been comforting, now felt suffocating. Then, the phone rang. Mia jumped, her heart racing as she reached for it. The caller ID was unfamiliar, just a random number. She hesitated for a moment, but something compelled her to answer. "Hello?" she said, her voice unsteady. There was a brief pause on the other end. Then a voice, soft and eerily calm, spoke. "I'm still here." Mia froze. The voice sounded distant, like it was coming from far away. Her blood ran cold. She didn't recognize the voice, and it sent a shiver down her spine. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice shaking, but there was no answer. The line went dead, the phone emitting a faint buzzing noise. Mia stood there, holding the phone to her ear, heart pounding. Who could it be? Why were they doing this? She hung up quickly, her hands trembling, but the feeling of dread didn't fade. She felt watched. Her eyes darted around the room as if expecting someone to jump out at her. The feeling that she wasn't alone, that someone was just out of sight, grew stronger with every passing second. She moved cautiously toward her bedroom, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something beyond her control. She double-checked the locks on the windows, then checked the door again, making sure everything was secure. It wasn't until she stepped back into the living room that she realized something horrifying. There was no sound, no creaks, no hum of the refrigerator. The apartment was so quiet that it felt unnatural, and then, just as she turned to head back to the couch, she heard it again, a knock, knock, knock. It was coming from the door. This time, Mia's heart stopped. She stood frozen in place, staring at the door. The same sharp, quick knock. She didn't dare move toward it. She didn't dare open it. The air in the apartment had gone still, heavy with a presence she couldn't shake. The knock came again, and again, and again. Each time, the silence between the knocks felt deeper, more suffocating. Mia's pulse was racing now, and she felt as if the walls were closing in on her. She glanced toward the peephole once more, but all she saw was the same dark hallway outside. No one. Nothing. But she still heard it. Knock. Knock. Her breath hitched in her throat. She backed away slowly, unable to tear her eyes away from the door. It was as if the knocks were getting closer, louder. She didn't know what was happening, who was there or what they wanted, but one thing was clear. Whoever it was, they weren't leaving, and they were still there. Story 24. The sensation of someone sitting down next to you, but you're alone. Lena had always loved the quiet solitude of her evenings at home. She had just moved into a small, cozy apartment on the edge of town, and after a long week of unpacking and adjusting to her new routine, she relished the peace it provided. She liked it this way, alone with her thoughts, the soft hum of the refrigerator, and the low buzz of the streetlights outside her window. One evening, as she sat curled up on the couch with a book in hand, she felt it. A subtle shift in the air, a slight disturbance that was hard to explain. It wasn't loud, it wasn't immediate, but it was unmistakable. The cushions beside her sank, as if someone had just sat down next to her. She froze, her hands still gripping the book, the pages now completely forgotten. For a split second, she thought someone had come into her apartment, someone she hadn't heard. Her heart skipped a beat. She quickly turned her head, expecting to see a person sitting beside her, but the couch was empty. No one was there. The apartment was still, the soft glow of the table lamp casting long shadows against the walls. Confused and a little unsettled, Lena shrugged it off. It had to be a trick of the mind, she reasoned. Maybe the weight of the cushions had shifted somehow. She set her book down on the coffee table and stretched her legs out, trying to relax. But just as she started to settle again, she felt it a second time. The cushions beside her shifted. The air around her seemed to change, as though someone was close by. She could almost feel the warmth of another body, the slight weight pressing down on the cushion next to her. Lena's heart began to race. She slowly looked over, half expecting to see someone beside her now. But again, the spot was empty. Her thoughts spun wildly. Was it the old building? Perhaps the floorboards were creaking, or something was off with the furniture. She wasn't sure, but something inside her began to feel uneasy, as if she wasn't truly alone after all. Trying to regain her composure, Lena stood up and walked around the apartment. She checked the door locks, peered into the kitchen, and even opened the bathroom door just to make sure. Everything was in place. There was no one in the apartment, and yet the feeling lingered. It hung in the air like a shadow, just out of reach. She returned to the couch, her stomach in knots. She tried to distract herself with the TV, flicking through channels, but her mind wouldn't stop racing. She kept glancing toward the empty space next to her, where she had felt someone sit. The air felt heavier now, more oppressive. The sensation was becoming overwhelming, as if someone or something was sitting just out of her sight. It wasn't a tangible presence, not in the way you'd expect from a person, but it was there nonetheless, an energy, a weight that she couldn't explain. Then it happened again, the soft shift of the cushions beside her. She could almost hear the faint sound of fabric moving, the gentle press of someone settling into the seat. It was unmistakable, and it was real. Her pulse quickened, and she shot up from the couch, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her mind raced to make sense of it. Was she losing her mind? Had she somehow imagined it? But it was too real, too vivid. She could feel it, just as clearly as if someone had sat right next to her. She backed away from the couch, her eyes scanning the room. It was a small apartment, and the only other room was the bedroom. But she wasn't about to check there. She didn't want to be alone with the sensation. Lena grabbed her phone, hands trembling as she dialed her best friend, Sarah. She needed someone to talk to, someone to ground her. The phone rang, and just as she was about to hang up, Sarah answered. "Lena, what's wrong? You sound off." I don't know what's happening," Lena stammered. "I keep feeling like someone's sitting next to me, on the couch. I don't know what's going on, but there's no one here." Sarah was quiet for a moment, and Lena could hear the rustling of her friend's voice as she shifted. "Are you sure you're just not tired or imagining it?" "I wish I was," Lena whispered. "I wish I was just imagining it, but it's so real, Sarah. I can feel it, the weight of someone sitting there, and I can't explain it." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Lena's heart began to pound harder in her chest. "Lena," Sarah said, her voice low, "this might sound strange, but you might not be as alone as you think." Lena felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" "I'm just saying," Sarah continued. "Sometimes old places, old buildings, they have energy, residual energy from the past. It's like they hold on to moments, people. Maybe you're not the only one living there." Lena felt her blood run cold. The air in the apartment seemed to grow even heavier, the weight pressing in on her chest. She set the phone down slowly, not saying goodbye, and turned to face the couch. The spot next to her was still empty, but the air felt thick, like something was just behind her, watching. Suddenly, the sensation of someone sitting beside her returned. This time, it was unmistakable. She could almost feel the warmth of their presence, could feel the subtle pressure on the cushions. Lena stood up abruptly, a burst of adrenaline flooding her body. Her heart raced, and the apartment seemed to pulse with an eerie silence. She left the apartment that night, unable to shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still sitting on that couch, waiting for her to return. Story 25. the sudden urge to check behind you, only to find nothing there. Emma had always loved working late at night. There was something soothing about the stillness, the quiet hum of her desk lamp, and the way the world outside seemed to pause. Her small apartment, tucked away on a quiet street, felt like a haven during these moments of solitude. Tonight was no different. Just her, a cup of tea, and her laptop glowing softly in the darkened room. The hours ticked by unnoticed as Emma worked, her focus deep and uninterrupted. That is, until she felt it. A creeping sensation began at the base of her neck, prickling her skin and making the hairs on her arms stand on end. It wasn't anything loud or obvious, just a quiet, gnawing awareness that something was off. She tried to shake it off, chalking it up to sitting too long in the same position. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. It was a pull, an almost magnetic urge to turn around and look behind her. Her logical mind fought against it. There's nothing there. You're just tired. But no matter how much she tried to convince herself, the sensation lingered, growing heavier, sharper. Emma's fingers hovered over her keyboard, her thoughts derailed by the growing unease. Her apartment was small, and she knew it was empty. She had locked the door, double-checked the windows. Still, the feeling persisted, clawing at her thoughts like a whisper she couldn't quite hear. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. With a deep breath, Emma spun her chair around to face the room behind her. Her eyes scanned the space quickly. The couch, the bookshelf, the shadows in the corners. Nothing. Just the familiar, dimly lit outlines of her apartment. She let out a shaky laugh, feeling foolish for letting her imagination get the better of her. "You're being ridiculous," she muttered to herself, turning back to her desk. But as soon as she did, the feeling came rushing back. This time, it was stronger, more insistent. It wasn't just the urge to look. It was the undeniable certainty that someone was standing right behind her. Her breath caught in her throat, and her hands froze on the keyboard. The room seemed to grow quieter, as if the very air was holding its breath. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears. She didn't want to turn around again. She didn't want to see, but she also couldn't ignore it. Slowly, hesitantly, she turned her head. Her eyes darted to the shadows, searching for any movement. Again, there was nothing there, just the same empty room, the same stillness. Emma exhaled shakily, trying to calm the rising panic. She stood up, walking around the apartment to reassure herself. She checked the locks on the windows, the latch on the front door, even the closet. Everything was as it should be. There was no one there but her. Feeling slightly more at ease, she returned to her desk, though the lingering unease refused to fade completely. She sat down and tried to refocus on her work, but her eyes kept flicking to the edge of the screen, as if she might catch something moving in her peripheral vision. Minutes passed, then an hour. Slowly, the tension began to ease, and Emma started to feel more like herself again. The logical part of her mind won out, convincing her that it had all been her imagination. But just as she reached for a cup of tea, it happened. A faint noise, so soft she almost missed it, came from behind her. It wasn't loud, just the subtle sound of something shifting, like fabric brushing against itself. Her body went rigid, her hand frozen midair. Her mind raced. You're alone. You're alone. You're alone. But the sensation was back, stronger than ever, gripping her like icy fingers wrapping around her neck. The air felt heavy, thick with something unexplainable. Her pulse quickened, and her breath came in shallow gasps. She could feel it now, feel the presence behind her, almost as if it were leaning closer. This time, she didn't want to turn around. She didn't want to know. But the sensation was unbearable, clawing at her mind, forcing her to look. Her heart hammering in her chest, Emma slowly turned her head, her eyes darting to every corner of the room. Nothing. The room was as it had always been, quiet, still, empty. But that didn't ease her fear. She could feel it. She knew something was there, even if she couldn't see it. Emma sat frozen for what felt like an eternity, her eyes wide and her breath shallow. Finally, she forced herself to turn back to her desk, though every nerve in her body screamed at her not to. She stared at the glowing screen, trying to convince herself that everything was fine. But as she reached for her tea, her hand stopped mid-motion. The mug had moved. It wasn't where she had left it. It was a few inches closer to the edge of the desk, as if someone or something had nudged it forward. Her blood ran cold. The urge to turn around hit her like a wave, but this time she didn't give in. She sat there, paralyzed, her eyes locked on the screen as the weight of the presence behind her grew heavier, suffocating, and then she heard it, a soft, low whisper, so close it felt like it was right in her ear. Don't turn around. Story 26. Hearing a child's laughter echoing in an empty house. Jessica had only just moved into the old Victorian house on the outskirts of town. It was an odd choice for her, a sprawling, creaky structure meant for a large family, not a single woman. But the price had been too good to pass up, and she convinced herself that the charm of the place outweighed its eerie reputation. The locals had warned her about its past, whispered tales of a tragic fire and the family that never left. But Jessica wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. On her third night in the house, Jessica sat in the living room, unpacking boxes while the wind howled outside. The house groaned with the strain of age and weather, and though it was unsettling at first, she had started to get used to its peculiar noises. It was nearing midnight when she first heard it. Faint, almost too soft to catch, but unmistakable, a child's laughter. It floated through the air, light and carefree, echoing faintly through the empty halls. Jessica froze, her hands still gripping the stack of books she was unpacking. She listened intently, the only sound now the pounding of her heart. The laughter didn't come again. Shaking her head, she forced a laugh. Old houses make weird noises, she muttered to herself. She returned to her task, but her focus was shattered. Every creak and groan of the house made her jump, her ears straining for the sound of that laugh. An hour passed, and she began to relax again. She chalked it up to the wind playing tricks on her. But just as she started to feel at ease, the laughter came again, louder this time, clearer. It echoed through the house, bouncing off the walls like a mischievous secret. Jessica's blood ran cold. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the house. She stood up slowly, her eyes darting toward the staircase. The laughter seemed to be coming from upstairs. She hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to leave, but curiosity, or maybe denial, got the better of her. She grabbed her phone for light and began ascending the creaky stairs. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. Is someone there?" The only response was the soft whistle of the wind through the cracks in the windows. She reached the top of the stairs, her phone's flashlight casting eerie shadows on the peeling wallpaper. The hallway stretched out before her, dark and foreboding. She walked cautiously, peeking into each room. The old nursery at the end of the hall caught her attention, a small, forgotten space filled with dust-covered toys and an empty crib. She stepped inside, her breath visible in the sudden chill that enveloped the room. The laughter came again, soft and close, as if it were right beside her. Jessica whipped around, her flashlight sweeping the room, but it was empty. The toys sat untouched, the crib lifeless. Her heart pounded in her chest as she backed out of the room, desperate to escape the oppressive cold. As she turned to leave, something caught her eye, a tiny handprint on the dusty window, smeared as if a child had pressed against the glass from the inside. Her breath hitched as she realized the print was fresh. She fled down the stairs, her phone clattering to the floor in her panic. She didn't stop until she was outside, gasping for air on the front porch. The wind had calmed, and the night was eerily silent. She stared up at the house, its dark windows seeming to watch her. From the nursery window, she thought she saw movement, a flicker of light, a shadow passing by. And then, faintly, the laughter came again, drifting out into the night like a sinister lullaby. Jessica never went back into the house. She sold it within a month, leaving behind the laughter, the handprint, and whatever unseen presence still lingered in the halls. Story 27. Seeing an unknown face reflected in a mirror or window. Maya had always loved antique shops. She enjoyed rummaging through forgotten treasures, imagining the stories they carried. So when she stumbled upon an ornate, full-length mirror at a small roadside store, she couldn't resist. Its carved wooden frame, weathered but elegant, seemed to call out to her. "This piece has a lot of history," the shopkeeper said with a faint smile. His tone was light, but something in his eyes seemed to suggest a warning. Maya didn't ask for details. She loved the mirror and bought it without hesitation. She hung it in her bedroom, leaning it against the wall near the window. It fit perfectly, adding a touch of timeless charm to her otherwise modern decor. That night, as she got ready for bed, she admired her reflection in the mirror, tracing the intricate carvings on the frame. The room behind her was still and quiet, just as it should be. The first incident happened the next morning. As she brushed her hair in front of the mirror, something caught her eye, a fleeting movement in the reflection. She turned quickly, expecting to see her cat, but the room was empty. Shrugging it off, she told herself it was nothing more than a trick of the light. But as the days went on, the occurrences became more frequent. A shadow passing in the corner of her vision. A faint outline in the mirror that disappeared when she turned. At first, she thought it was her mind playing tricks on her, the product of stress or lack of sleep. One night, as she was preparing to go to bed, she lingered in front of the mirror, adjusting her pajamas. The room behind her looked normal. Her bed, her dresser, the faint glow of the street lamp outside casting soft light through the window. But then she noticed it. A face. It was faint, barely visible at first, but as her eyes adjusted, she saw it clearly. A pale, expressionless face staring back at her from the depths of the mirror. The features were sharp, the eyes hollow and dark, like empty sockets. It wasn't her face. And it wasn't just behind her. It was in the mirror, staring out as if trapped inside. Maya froze, her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move, couldn't tear her gaze away. The face didn't move, didn't blink. It simply stared, unchanging, unyielding. Summoning every ounce of courage, she spun around to face the room, but it was empty. Her heart hammered in her chest as she turned back to the mirror, hoping, praying that the face was gone. It wasn't. Instead, it had moved closer. The face now filled the center of the mirror, its hollow eyes seeming to pierce through her. And then, for the first time, it moved. Its lips curled into a slow, sinister smile. Maya stumbled backward, her legs giving out as she fell to the floor. The smile widened, impossibly large, stretching unnaturally across the face. She scrambled to her feet and ran out of the room, slamming the door behind her. She spent the night on the couch, every light in the house turned on. Morning came slowly, and with it, a shred of courage. Armed with a blanket and a hammer, she returned to the bedroom, determined to rid herself of the mirror. But when she opened the door, the mirror was gone. The spot where it had rested was empty, the wall behind it bare. She searched the entire house, top to bottom, but it was nowhere to be found. It was as if it had never been there at all. Maya moved out of the apartment a week later. She left most of her belongings behind, unwilling to risk taking anything with her. But even in her new home, far away from the old mirror, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Sometimes when passing by reflective surfaces, a window, a phone screen, even a puddle, she thought she saw it. Just for a moment, a face staring back at her, pale and hollow, smiling that impossible smile. She no longer looked at her reflection for too long. Story 28, a deep, unsettling sound that seems to come from beneath the floor. Daniel had never been a fan of old houses, but the price on this one had been too good to pass up. Nestled in a quiet countryside, the creaky, two-story home promised solitude, something he desperately needed after the chaos of city life. It wasn't perfect, but it was his, and he relished the idea of fixing it up on his own. The first few weeks went by peacefully. The days were spent sanding floors and painting walls, while the nights were quiet, save for the occasional creak of settling wood. The peace, however, was shattered one evening as Daniel was reading in the living room. At first, he thought he had imagined it, a low, guttural hum, so faint it was almost imperceptible. He set his book down and listened, but the sound was gone. Shrugging it off, he returned to his reading. But then it came again. This time it was deeper, a resonating vibration that seemed to rise from beneath the floorboards. The sound wasn't like anything he'd ever heard. It wasn't plumbing, or the wind, or the house settling. It was primal, unnatural. He stood and paced the room, his ears straining to locate the source. It seemed to move, as though whatever was making the noise was shifting beneath him. When it stopped, Daniel laughed nervously, shaking his head. "Old houses," he muttered. The noise returned the next night, louder and more insistent. It woke him from a deep sleep, reverberating through the silence. He sat up in bed, his heart pounding as the sound pulsed beneath him, rhythmic and alive. He stared at the floor, half expecting it to shake, Unable to sleep, he grabbed a flashlight and made his way to the basement. The stairs creaked under his weight as he descended, the air growing colder with each step. The basement was as old as the house itself, stone walls, dirt floor, and a musty smell that never quite went away. The sound was louder down here, reverberating off the walls and shaking the very air. It was coming from beneath the dirt floor, no doubt about it. Kneeling down, Daniel pressed his ear to the ground. The vibrations were stronger here, and for the first time he thought he heard something beneath the sound, a faint rhythmic thumping, like the beating of a colossal heart. His stomach churned. What could possibly be making that noise? A burst pipe? Some kind of machinery he didn't know about? He decided to investigate. The next morning, armed with a shovel and a flashlight, Daniel began digging. The dirt was packed tightly, and each shovelful came up heavier than the last. As he dug deeper, the sound grew louder, pulsing like a living thing. 4 feet down, his shovel struck something solid. It wasn't stone, and it wasn't wood. He scraped the dirt away to reveal a smooth black surface. It gleamed faintly in the dim basement light, as if it absorbed every glimmer. Curious and unnerved, Daniel brushed his hand over the surface. It was ice cold to the touch, and the vibration was strongest here, pulsing beneath his fingertips. And then it happened. The noise stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Daniel knelt there, holding his breath, his hand still resting on the strange surface. Then, a single sharp sound split the air, a crack. The black surface splintered beneath his hand, jagged lines spreading out like spider webs. The vibration returned, violent and erratic, shaking the ground so hard that Daniel fell backward. The noise was no longer just a hum or a thump. It was a roar, deep and guttural, echoing through the basement like a beast awakening after a long slumber. Panicked, Daniel scrambled up the stairs, slamming the door behind him. The house shook as the sound grew louder, resonating through the walls and floorboards, and then as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost more terrifying. Daniel sat on the floor, shaking, his ears ringing from the sound. He didn't sleep that night, and when morning came, he resolved to leave the house for good. But as he packed his bags, he noticed something strange. The floor in the living room seemed warped, bulging slightly upward, as if something beneath was pushing against it. And then he heard it again, the deep, unsettling hum, rising from below, stronger than ever. Daniel didn't look back as he fled the house, leaving behind his belongings, his dreams of solitude, and the terrifying secret buried beneath the floor. Weeks later, the house sat vacant, its windows dark and lifeless. But the townsfolk swore they could still hear it. Late at night, a low, resonating hum, pulsing through the ground like the heartbeat of something waiting to rise. Story 29, a picture frame that suddenly cracks on its own. Sophie loved decorating her small apartment with meaningful items. The photo wall in her living room was her favorite, a collection of memories carefully framed and arranged. Among them was a photo of her and her late grandmother, taken during a summer visit to the countryside. It was her most treasured picture, framed in polished wood and placed at the center of the wall. One quiet evening, Sophie sat on the couch, sipping tea and scrolling through her phone. The soft hum of the TV played in the background, and the comforting glow of her string lights gave the room a cozy feel. Everything felt peaceful, ordinary. Then, without warning, the sharp sound of glass shattering pierced the air. Sophie jumped, spilling her tea as her heart raced. She looked toward the source of the noise, the photo wall. Her grandmother's frame was shattered, the glass splintered into jagged shards, but the others were untouched. She approached the wall cautiously, her pulse quickening. How could this happen? There hadn't been any impact or movement, no vibrations, no wind, nothing that could explain the sudden break. She carefully removed the frame, pieces of glass tinkling to the floor. The photograph remained intact, but the sight of it sent a chill down her spine. The image was different. In the original photo, she and her grandmother had been smiling, standing in a sunny garden. Now her grandmother's face appeared blurred, her smile gone. The rest of the photo was perfectly clear, but her grandmother's image seemed distorted, as though it had faded or shifted. Sophie stared, unable to process what she was seeing. She shook her head and rubbed her eyes, convincing herself it was a trick of the light. But when she looked again, the distortion remained. Unnerved, she placed the photo and broken frame on the table and swept up the glass. As she cleaned, a faint smell of lavender wafted through the room. It was so subtle at first that she thought she imagined it, but it grew stronger. Lavender, her grandmother's favorite scent. Sophie froze, the broom slipping from her hands. The air seemed heavier, charged, as if she weren't alone. A faint creak came from the hallway, followed by the sound of a soft sigh. She spun around, her eyes darting to the darkened hall. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no response, just an unsettling silence. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, a coincidence, her imagination running wild. But as the night wore on, strange things continued to happen. The lights flickered briefly, and the room grew colder, despite the heater running at full blast. Unable to sleep, Sophie sat on the couch, clutching a blanket. Her eyes kept drifting to the photograph on the table. Something about it felt wrong, as if it were watching her. At exactly 3 a.m., her phone buzzed. She picked it up, expecting a message, but there was nothing. The screen displayed the time and a blank notification, but no calls or texts had come through. And then faintly, the sound of a voice, her grandmother's voice. "Sophie?" It was barely a whisper, but it was unmistakable. The voice seemed to come from the direction of the table. Trembling, Sophie grabbed the photo, her fingers brushing against the fractured frame. The lavender scent grew stronger, overwhelming, as the air seemed to thrum with energy. "Grandma?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Is that you?" The room fell silent again. And then, in the reflection of the broken glass, Sophie saw it. A fleeting image of her grandmother's face, sad and distant, mouthing something she couldn't hear. The frame cracked again, this time splitting the wood. Sophie dropped it with a gasp. The glass shards sparkled on the floor, the photo now completely blank. She spent the rest of the night at a friend's house, too shaken to stay alone. When she returned the next day, the photograph was gone. The frame and glass remained, but the picture had vanished entirely. Sophie eventually moved out of the apartment, but she kept the broken frame in a box, unable to bring herself to throw it away. Sometimes late at night, she swore she could still smell lavender, faint and fleeting, as though someone had been there just moments before. Story 30. The realization that your pets are acting strangely, staring at something invisible. Lila loved her 2 cats, Muffin and Toby. They were her constant companions in the quiet house, bringing her comfort and entertainment. Muffin was the adventurous one, always exploring nooks and crannies, while Toby preferred lounging and observing from his favorite perch by the window. It started on a Tuesday evening. Lila was curled up on the couch, a bowl of popcorn in her lap, as she watched a rerun of her favorite show. Muffin was darting around the room, chasing a toy mouse, while Toby lounged nearby, purring softly. Everything felt normal, cozy, until Muffin stopped dead in her tracks. Her fur bristled as she stared at the far corner of the room, her tail puffing up like a bottle brush. She hissed, a sound Lila rarely heard from her playful cat, and backed away slowly, her wide eyes fixed on something invisible. "Toby?" Lila said, her voice trembling as she glanced at her other cat. Toby, usually indifferent to disturbances, had sat upright, his ears perked and his gaze locked on the same corner. His tail twitched, and a low growl escaped his throat. Lila turned toward the corner. Nothing was there, just the wall, bare and unremarkable. She laughed nervously, trying to shake off the growing unease. "What's wrong, you two? A shadow? A bug?" Neither cat moved. Muffin crept closer to Lila, jumping onto the couch and nestling into her side, still glaring at the corner. Toby remained rooted, his eyes unblinking. For the rest of the evening, the cats refused to relax. Muffin stayed glued to Lila, her body tense, while Toby patrolled the house, occasionally pausing to stare into empty spaces. Lila tried to ignore it, brushing it off as one of their odd feline quirks, but the unease lingered. The following night, things escalated. Lila was in the kitchen, making tea, when she heard a loud thud from the living room. She rushed in to find Muffin and Toby both crouched low to the ground, their eyes following something moving along the ceiling. Their heads turned in unison, as though tracking an invisible presence. Muffin let out a guttural yowl, a sound Lila had never heard before. "Stop it!" Lila snapped, her nerves frayed. She clapped her hands, trying to break whatever trance the cats were in. Muffin darted under the couch, but Toby stayed put, his gaze still fixed upward. The sound of creaking wood broke the silence, and Lila's heart jumped. It came from directly above her, her bedroom. But she lived alone, and no one else had a key. She grabbed her phone and slowly ascended the stairs, Muffin trailing hesitantly behind her. Toby stayed in the living room, staring at the ceiling. The upstairs hallway was dark, the air heavy and cold. As she approached her bedroom door, she could hear a faint rustling sound, like fabric brushing against wood. Summoning her courage, Lila pushed the door open. The room was empty, just as she'd left it. But the rustling continued, growing louder, coming from the far corner of the room. Her eyes darted to her wardrobe, its door slightly ajar. She stared, frozen, as the rustling abruptly stopped. Then the door creaked open wider. Muffin hissed from behind her, her low growl vibrating through the air. Lila backed away, her breath catching in her throat. She slammed the bedroom door shut and fled downstairs, her heart pounding. The cats were waiting for her, their eyes wide and unblinking. Toby had joined Muffin, both of them now staring at the staircase, their bodies rigid. The air seemed heavier, almost suffocating. Lila didn't sleep that night. She sat on the couch with the cats, her phone in hand, ready to call someone, anyone, if things got worse. Every creak, every shadow, every rustle of the wind outside felt magnified, her imagination running wild. In the morning, the house felt normal again. The cats relaxed, curling up in their usual spots as if nothing had happened. But Lila couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of something unseen lurking just out of sight. Over the next few weeks, the cats continued their strange behavior, staring at corners, growling at empty spaces, and refusing to enter certain rooms. Lila noticed other oddities, too. Doors she knew she'd closed left ajar, faint whispers just at the edge of hearing, and the sensation of cold air brushing against her skin when there were no drafts. One night, as she lay in bed, Muffin curled up beside her, she woke to the sound of a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the wardrobe. She held her breath, her body frozen with fear. The tapping stopped, replaced by a faint, chilling whisper that sent shivers down her spine. "Leela?" Muffin hissed and bolted off the bed, her claws scratching the hardwood floor as she fled. The whisper came again, clearer this time, and Lila knew she wouldn't stay in the house another night. The next morning, she packed her things and left, the cats riding silently in their carriers. She never went back, but sometimes, even in her new apartment, she caught Muffin and Toby staring at the corners, their eyes wide and unblinking, as if they could still see something she couldn't. Story 31. A whispering sound coming from the vents or pipes. Mark had always been skeptical about the paranormal. He prided himself on being a logical thinker, someone who needed evidence and reason to explain the strange and unusual. So when he moved into the modest, two-bedroom house on the outskirts of town, he paid no mind to the house's age or the rumors from neighbors about its history. The first few weeks were uneventful. Mark settled into his routine, enjoying the solitude after years of living in noisy apartments. The house creaked occasionally, but that was expected in a place over 50 years old. One night, as Mark lay in bed scrolling through his phone, he heard it for the first time. A faint, almost imperceptible whispering sound. He paused, holding his breath to listen. It was coming from the vent near the floor. At first, he thought it was the wind or perhaps a problem with the HVAC system. He leaned closer, his ear nearly touching the vent's slotted cover. The sound grew clearer, soft, fragmented whispers that seemed to form no distinct words, yet carried an unsettling urgency. Mark shook his head and laughed nervously. "Old pipes," he muttered to himself, climbing back into bed. But the whispers didn't stop. The next night, they returned, louder this time. Mark, irritated and a little unnerved, decided to investigate. He turned off the heating system, thinking the sound might be air moving through the ducts. Yet, as the vents grew silent from lack of airflow, the whispering continued. Armed with a flashlight, Mark opened the vent in his bedroom. He shone the beam into the darkness, revealing little more than dust and cobwebs. The whispering stopped as soon as he peered in, leaving an eerie silence that felt heavier than before. He decided to check the crawl space the next morning, determined to find a logical explanation. Beneath the house, the narrow space was damp and dark, the smell of earth and mildew filling his nostrils. As he crawled along with his flashlight, he examined the ductwork. looking for cracks or signs of animals nesting. Everything appeared normal, but as he reached the far end of the crawl space, the whispering returned, soft and distant, echoing through the ducts. It wasn't random noise. It sounded deliberate, like voices attempting to form words. "Hello?" Mark called out, his voice wavering. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie stillness. He held his breath, straining to hear anything, but the silence was suffocating. Then, faintly, a voice responded. "Mark?" He scrambled out of the crawl space, his heart pounding. He tried to convince himself he'd imagined it. Maybe his name had been distorted by the wind or the sound of his own breathing. Yet deep down, he knew better. That night, the whispers grew louder, spreading throughout the house. No longer confined to the bedroom vent, they emanated from the kitchen, the living room, and even the bathroom. Mark wandered the house, flashlight in hand, trying to locate the source. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice echoing in the empty halls. The whispers swirled around him, rising and falling in a maddening cacophony. For the first time, he could make out fragments of words. Help. Lost. Beneath. His heart raced as he realized the voices seemed to be coming from all the vents at once, surrounding him. Desperate for answers, Mark called an HVAC technician the next morning. The man arrived, a grizzled worker with years of experience, and spent hours inspecting the system. When he was done, he shrugged and said, "Everything's in good shape. No leaks, no animals. Probably just the house settling or air moving through old ducts." Mark wasn't convinced. The whispers didn't sound like air. They sounded alive. That night, Mark decided to record the sounds. He set up his phone next to the vent in his bedroom and left it running while he tried to sleep. The whispers returned, louder and more coherent than ever. When he reviewed the recording the next morning, his blood ran cold. The whispers were clear, unmistakable, and now undeniably speaking words. Beneath the house, trapped, can't leave. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. The voices seemed to overlap, as if multiple people were speaking at once. And then came a single, unmistakable sentence that sent him reeling. "You shouldn't be here." He packed a bag and left the house that same day, staying in a motel while he decided what to do next. When he returned a week later to retrieve the rest of his belongings, the whispers were gone. The house felt empty, lifeless, as though whatever had been there had vanished. But as Mark stood in the doorway, surveying the living room one last time, he heard it again. A faint, distant whisper coming from the vents, growing louder with every passing second. He didn't wait to find out what it wanted. Story 32. An old photo you don't remember taking, showing people you don't recognize. When Emma moved into her first apartment, she was thrilled to decorate it with personal touches. She spent weekends scouring thrift stores for unique furniture and frames, filling her walls with a mix of her own photographs and vintage art. One rainy Saturday, she found an ornate wooden box at a flea market. The vendor claimed it was an antique photo box, and inside were several faded pictures. Most were of landscapes or old buildings, but one frame was empty, its back sealed tightly with brittle nails. Emma bought the box, thinking it would make a perfect centerpiece for her coffee table. Later that night, as she was rearranging her decorations, she noticed the frame again. Something about it drew her attention. Despite its empty appearance, she felt compelled to pry open the back. Using a flathead screwdriver, she carefully removed the nails and lifted the backing. Tucked behind the glass was a photograph. It was old, sepia-toned, and slightly curled at the edges. The image showed a group of 5 people standing in front of a house. They were dressed in early 20th century clothing, high-collared dresses, suspenders, and bowler hats. A man stood in the center, his arm around a woman holding a small child. 2 other men flanked them, all of their faces somber. At first, Emma thought it was just another forgotten relic left in the frame, but as she studied the photo more closely, something felt off. The house in the background looked eerily familiar. Her stomach turned as she realized why. It was the house she was living in. She flipped the photo over, hoping for an inscription or date, but the back was blank. Unease crept in as she returned her gaze to the photo. She didn't recognize the people, but something about the way they stared into the camera, into her, felt unnerving. Shrugging off her discomfort, Emma placed the photo back into the frame and set it on her bookshelf. She convinced herself it was a coincidence. Maybe her landlord had left it behind. That night, she dreamed of the people in the photograph. They were in her living room, standing silently in the dim light. Their faces were pale and emotionless, their eyes fixed on her as she tried to move but couldn't. The child began to cry, a hollow, echoing wail that woke her in a cold sweat. The next morning, she decided to throw the photograph away. She pulled it out of the frame, only to find it had changed. The people were still there, but now their heads were turned slightly, as if they were looking over their shoulders at something behind them. Emma's breath caught in her throat. The change was impossible, yet undeniable. Her hands trembled as she shoved the photo into a drawer and slammed it shut. The following days were filled with strange occurrences. Footsteps echoed in the hall when she was alone. Lights flickered, and the air grew cold in certain rooms. The uneasy feeling of being watched followed her everywhere. Finally, Emma decided to investigate. She dug the photo out of the drawer and studied it again, hoping for some clue. This time, her eyes were drawn to the windows of the house in the background. There, in one of the upper panes, was a figure, a shadowy silhouette staring down at the group. She hadn't noticed it before. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, Emma searched online for any history about her building. Hours of digging through old records and archives finally led her to a shocking discovery. In the 1920s, the house had belonged to a family of 5. They'd all died in a fire that destroyed most of the upper floors. The father, who tried to save his family, was found at the window, his silhouette etched into the memories of the surviving neighbors. Emma's blood ran cold. The photo wasn't just an antique, it was a snapshot of the family before the tragedy. That night, unable to sleep, she heard a soft rustling. She turned toward the bookshelf and froze. The photo frame was glowing faintly, the image of the family clearer than ever. And then she saw it. The figures in the photo were moving. The child reached out, the mother turned her head, and the father stared directly at Emma. A soft, hollow voice whispered from the corner of the room, "Why did you wake us?" Emma fled the apartment that night, leaving the photograph and frame behind. She never returned, breaking her lease and moving to another city. Months later, the landlord called, frustrated. He'd found the apartment empty, but the photograph was still there, propped up on the mantel, pristine and undisturbed. No matter how many tenants came and went, the photo remained. And over the years, the figures in the image began to change. They always seemed to be looking at whoever lived there next. Story 33. The creepy feeling that someone is just behind you in your reflection. Claire had never been one to scare easily. As a self-proclaimed night owl, she often found herself awake long past midnight, the quiet of her small apartment offering a sense of peace. Tonight was no different. The soft glow of her desk lamp illuminated the room as she worked on a late-night project. She stretched, yawning, and glanced at the clock. 2:17 a.m. Deciding to take a break, she got up to grab a glass of water. The small mirror hanging on the wall near the kitchen caught her attention as she passed. It reflected her dimly lit living room and the hallway leading to her bedroom. But something felt wrong. Claire froze, staring into the mirror. She didn't know why, but a chill ran down her spine. It was as if the air in the room had shifted, the stillness becoming heavy and oppressive. She shook her head, trying to brush off the unease, and poured herself a glass of water. Returning to her desk, she passed the mirror again. This time, she felt it, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, as though someone was standing right behind her. She whipped around, her heart pounding. The room was empty. She laughed nervously. "Get a grip, Claire," she muttered, sitting back down at her desk. But the feeling lingered, gnawing at the edges of her mind. She found herself glancing at the mirror repeatedly, half expecting to see something she couldn't explain. Around 3 a.m., Claire decided to call it a night. She turned off her computer and stood to head to her bedroom. As she passed the mirror one last time, the sensation returned, stronger, more insistent. Her skin prickled and her breath quickened. Something was wrong. Slowly, she turned to face the mirror. Her reflection stared back at her, wide-eyed and pale. But there was something else. Behind her, barely visible in the dim light, was a shadowy figure. It stood just beyond her shoulder, its outline indistinct but undeniably there. Claire's blood ran cold. She spun around, her heart hammering. The room was empty. When she turned back to the mirror, the figure was gone. Telling herself it was a trick of the light, Claire hurried to her bedroom, shutting the door firmly behind her. She didn't sleep well. The image of the shadowy figure burned into her mind. The next day, she avoided the mirror. But as night fell, the strange feeling returned. This time, it wasn't confined to the mirror. She felt it everywhere she went, an invisible presence following her, always just out of sight. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, she decided to take the mirror down. She grabbed a hammer and gently pried it off the wall. As she carried it to her closet to store it away, the reflection caught her eye. For a split second, she saw her own face, but it wasn't her. Her reflection wore a sinister grin, its eyes dark and hollow. The mirror slipped from her hands and shattered on the floor. Claire stumbled back, her breath coming in ragged gasps. From the shards of broken glass, the reflection stared up at her, its grin widening. And then she felt it again. That presence, no longer confined to the mirror. It was behind her. She didn't have to turn around to know.